Hi, this is Scott Burns, and just here to speak to my buddies Tony and Ed, and I'll see you at the Tampa Morgue.
What's up? This is Tony, and you're listening to the Tampa Morgue Season 3, Episode 137. And from backstage somewhere in Poland, in the middle of the Screams Across Europe 2026 tour, Mr. Ed Webb. What's up, Webb?
Mr. Anderson, what the fuck is going on, brother? I'm about to kill somebody.
We've had some technical issues signing on here today from backstage over there, but we're here, so let's try to make it work. We opened up the show with Deicide and the track Crucifixation off the self-titled record that came out on RC/Roadrunner Records, June 25th, 1990. Who joins here in about 25 minutes by the legendary producer Scott Burns. And Ed, man, how's the tour going, dude? You're in Poland for a few shows now.
Yes, we are in Swidnica. I know that's not how you pronounce it, but that's how my English is going to pronounce it.
It's about as good as the Wi-Fi there.
Yeah, man. Club Bolko. And yeah, got a final show tonight of 6 straight, day off tomorrow, 6 more, and then I get to come home and use a real internet connection for the fucking first time in a month.
How, how's the tour been, man?
It's good. It's been good, man. There's been a couple of shows that were not very stellar. The crowd last night was great in Germany. So it's hit and miss. Last night was the last night for the opening band, Deadwood. They had to go back to Canada. So now we finish the rest of the tour with just the 3 bands.
And you guys played Essen Friday, right? Now you caught up with
Yes.
Atax and Scum of Germany's Pest, who we had on the show. What, episode 121, when they were doing their promo for Eternal Nightmares, the 2025 full length, and you caught up with those guys.
Yeah, yep, I did. I met them before I went on, and then I saw them after the show, and they gave me a signed record, and we hung out for a little bit. Yeah, they were cool guys. I was glad they made the trek over to see the show, and I hope they enjoyed it.
There's 136 episodes we've done to this point. Our first show aired August 5th, 2023. Neither of us ever said we wanted to do podcasts. It was not something we ever really talked about. We're pretty kind of do our own thing outside of the music stuff, kind of private people, right? And we've both been playing in bands forever. We're both from Jersey originally, but you spent more time in Tampa than I did. I moved to Tampa in the early 90s. You were there when this stuff was just getting started. We talked about this guest. I mean, and this guest's name has to be mentioned on the show every few episodes. Our guest tonight is going to be Scott Burns. But how many times, during the 136 episodes has his name popped up?
More than I can remember, and the last 2 big bands I have been in, he had something to do with. So there's that. So it's crazy to think about that.
And we've been wanting to get him on the show. Like, when we first started doing this, there was a handful of guys that me and Ed were like, hey, for this show we had no idea what we were doing at first. Like, we really, I don't know, we just signed on, started doing it one day, and then like somehow we've gotten to where we are now, which is really nowhere. But I mean, we've had some great guests. Year 3, like I said, first episode was August 5th of 23. And Scott Burns was a guy that we always knew we wanted to get on the show. The Scott Burns Sessions, A Life in Death Metal, 1987 to 1997, the book from David Gehlke came out, probably 2 years ago now?
Wow, it might even been a little longer, but yeah, somewhere in that vicinity, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we knew we wanted to get him on, man, but, we knew he was doing press and stuff like that. This year at the Tampa Bay Metal Museum, me and Ed, got a hold of him. It's a really cool guy, really down to earth. I have met Scott before, but I never really sat and had a conversation with him. Totally down to earth guy. We switched numbers, and yeah, heard from Scott, man. And I was really, I have a lot of respect for him, man, because, he said, hey, I'll get a hold of you. And how many times you hear that, right, Webb, in life? And definitely heard from
Yeah,
Scott, man. And we set it up and
yeah,
cannot thank him enough.
yeah, yeah, and he didn't have to do it, and he came, said he would come on, and he's coming on, and yeah, nothing but respect for Scott for sure.
Yeah, man. And do you remember the first time you met Scott?
It was probably this guy Trader Ed. I don't know if it was during when Sadist was recording, or I went up there. I didn't get to see Sepultura, but I was in the little studio when they were recording, and I saw and talked to Scott. But that was so long ago, man. Like I think it was during the Arise session, and the I want to say Swallowed in Black for Sadist, but I it's been so long I can't even remember.
And we're not going to spend much time with me and Ed tonight because obviously Ed's getting ready to play tonight. And then also, I'm sure everyone's waiting to hear from Scott. And Ed, I do what we always do and then get Scott on. We've been asking Ed, I'll actually have you explain, man, what we've been doing on the show.
Yeah, so we basically started at some point asking what your favorite Florida band, not Tampa specific, Florida band was. It didn't have to be death metal; it could be whatever. And then what album you felt was the biggest impact, like for you. Like what album from Florida, you know, would you say was your biggest? I guess the one you liked the most. And the the answers have been definitely I don't want to say predictable, but you could have kind of predicted if we would have been betting people. I kind of knew where some people would be going and where they would be picking. So yeah, it's a cool question. It's cool to hear how people feel about that, because everybody, especially if you're not from Tampa, has a different opinion of how that affected them one way or another. So um, yeah, it's been a cool thing we did. I don't know why we didn't do it sooner, but it's definitely cool.
And the question has evolved a little bit, I'll be honest. Like, first, like when we started doing it, it was Tampa Bay, and then we kind of moved it to Florida. So some of these answers are older than other ones. But tonight we asked Kyle Thomas from Exwater, Trouble, Floodgate, Alabama Thunder Pussy. We asked him this question. And we had Kyle on. He was on episode 33. We also had him on episode 125. The episode 125 was pretty recent. We dissected the whole slaughter in the Vatican 1990 record, which also Scott Burns was involved with. But we asked Kyle this question, and during these interviews, when we ask these guys this question, we actually don't include that answer in that segment for their full interviews. We save these off to the side for something like this, and this is when we started doing it. So the question eventually changed a little, but this week we asked Kyle Thomas that question, and this is what he had to say. We'll be back on the Tampa Morgue after this. Kyle, man, in your opinion, dude, what is the most important Tampa Bay band through the history, man? And what is your favorite Tampa Bay-based album?
Yeah, man, that's like that could vary from day to day, asking what ingredients I want on my pizza, right? um, I don't know, that's a really tough one, but I think of all the bands that came out of there, the one that spoke to me the most and probably the soonest. See, now that's a toss up. Wow. All right, so probably overall across the board, it would have to be Obituary. Um, I, you know, I liked. I got Slowly We Rot as a promo from back when we first started with Road Racer RC Records back at the time. But I can't say that the first two Death albums didn't strike me pretty heavily. Also, like I didn't really dive into much after Leprosy. I know I'm one of those guys. I'm not a giant death metal guy, so like death metal has to have something really special to me to make me want to listen to it over and over again. And what I can say about Obituary that really took me into another dimension with all of it was the identifiability. There's a proprietary edge that Obituary has, slow trudging, almost hardcore type riffs, just in a different delivery. But John Tardy's voice is so unique. I always say that, even though Ozzy's not even like the fifth greatest singer that Black Sabbath ever had, he has a uniqueness about his voice. His identifiability is like you can hear Ozzy's voice for like less than a second and know it's Ozzy. And it's kind of the same thing with John Tardy, I think.
There you go. That was Kyle Thomas. Again, if you want to hear his full episodes, he was on episode 33 and also episode 125. And yeah, Ed, I guess, we had a little Wi-Fi problems with the venue. So I don't know, maybe we should just kind of get the show moving a little bit. Every week we begin an episode out. Last week we had Slaughter and Carnivore of Germany's Cruel Force on the show. We had Possessor and S. Bellis of Austria's Transylvania the week before that. Jan and Marco of Germany's Witching Hour. We had Panzer Kampfwagen of Belgium's Possession. We had Seb, the bassist of Hell Militia, on the show. Tom, a Devastator. Chuck Billy of Testament, which was a 2-hour interview. Germany's Lead Injector. We had Brian Cause of Melting Rod on. This is the episodes we've had the last 2 months. So, what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little bit of the promo for the show where you'll hear about a lot more about those guests, more guests we had on. So what we'll do is we'll run the ad for Tampa Bay Family Fitness first, the Ed cut. Then we'll play some Death too. We'll play Death, Living Monstrosity from the Spiritual Healing record that came out on Combat Records in 1990. I was the producer on that one. So we're going to play that. And then we're going to go over releases. We'll go over shows, and then we'll get to Scott Burns before Ed loses Wi-Fi at the venue. So Ed, what do you say? Let's get going.
Let's do it, or lose my voice, whichever's first.
Yes. First, we're going to play the promo, then Death with Living Monstrosity from the Spiritual Healing record. We'll be back on the Tampa Morgue after this.
What's up, guys? This is Ed from the Morgue, and if you're like Tony and I and dedicated to working out, and you're from Tampa or will be visiting Tampa, I'm going to let you in on the best kept secret gym in the area, Tampa Family Fitness on the corner of Bears and Florida Avenue. And unlike the big box gyms where you're just a name and a number, the owners Sarah and Eddie Amaral have created a community where you're not just another face lost in the crowd. They also have, hands down, the best trainers in Tampa, with Coach J, Jared Perea, who I've personally witnessed take his clients to award-winning bodybuilders. Not to mention this dude is an absolute beast himself. So if you want to get in the best shape of your life, this is definitely the place to do it, and these are the people to do it with. So if you want a no-frills gym experience that I can only describe as old-school Arnold Schwarzenegger on Venice Beach, with no fancy machines, just get in, get your ass kicked, get a crushing workout, then you want to go to Tampa Family Fitness at 14968 North Florida Avenue. And if you're a band that's traveling to Tampa and playing the Orpheum or the Brass Mug, this is literally less than a 5-minute drive from either location. There's a QR code on the door. Just scan it, pay $10, and you're good to go for the whole day. Or if you're in Tampa and you want to see what all the hype's about, stop in and get a day pass, and make sure you tell them Ed sent you from the Tampa Morgue.
With life comes pain, withdrawals, and deformation breaking. The mold of human appearance contorting. Bodies chemical with the virus. The guilty one, innocent she now cries. Life of hell, better off to die. Born without eyes, hands, and have a brain. Be born addicted to cocaine. Living monstrosity, freak for life they'll always be. Never knowing love or hate, only pain the drug creates. Some say she's naive, she's a stupid bitch. Some say to forgive, guilty she should die. The beginning of the end begins at birth, breeding masses twisted, screaming flesh. An example we should make out of these creators of misfortune, a serious crime that should not be forgiven. Guilty one, innocent she now cries, life of hell, better off to die. Born blood eyes, hands, and half a brain, being born addicted to cocaine.
Welcome back to the Morgue in episode 137, and that was Death with Living Monstrosity. And we'll be joined by the one and only legendary producer Scott Burns here in about 10 minutes. If this is your first time listening to the show, thanks for checking us out. If you'd like to contact us, send us an email to thetampamorgue@gmail.com or send us a message to the official Tampa Morgue Instagram page. The Instagram page is the best place to keep up with upcoming guests, basically anything Tampa Morgue related. And as we always say, we are in no way influencers. We are just an underground audio show that documents the history of extreme music with the artists who create it. And this is episode 137. You can go back and listen to 136 prior episodes wherever you listen to your podcast for free. And if you do go back into the Tampa Morgue catalog, you'll find interviews with artists like Vincent Crowley of Asheron, ex-Nocturnus, the Vincent Crowley Band, Dave and Jeff from Imprecation out of Texas, Dawn of the Dead from Nunslaughter and Satanic Threat, Snowy Shaw of Merciful Fate, King Diamond, Notre Dame. He was on for 4 hours, great episode. Alice Toller Wade from Narcotic Wasteland and Ex-Nihil, Amy Bailey from Brodequin and Liturgy, Henry from God Dethroned, Matt Bishop from Human Artifacts, Horrific Demise and Ex-Levidity. We did a deep dive with King Fally of Deceased on October 31. Definitely recommend checking that out. Blaine Cook of The Accused and The Accused AD. Gene from Perdition Temple, Malefic Throne, Ex-Angel Corpse, and Hexorcist. Chris Reifert from Autopsy, Abscess, Eat My Fucking Violation Wound. Lee Payne from Club and Hoof. Ryan Waste from Municipal Waste, Bat, and Vulture. We had Pooch from Raped Ape on the show. We had Harry Quokenen from Hooded Menace, Hail Conjurer, Horse Latitudes, and Hollow Woods on here. Dave Greger of Mortis Scold. Jim and Pat from Morbid Saint. Carl Kennedy from The Rods. Paul Speckman from Master, Deathstrike. Bill Owen from Purgatory. John Gallagher of Raven, Dave Austin of Nasty Savage, David Howard Thornton, who played Art the Clown in the Terrifier films, Lord Araman from Dark Funeral, Bobby G from Overkill and Satan's Taint, Rob from Lucifericon at Ex-Destroyer 666, Luciferian Rights out of Mexico, Martin Missy from Protector, Phantom out of Mexico. Jeff Manis was on here for 5 hours from Venom and Venom Inc. And on that episode, Jeff takes us on a deep dive into the history of Venom. Always recommend that if you're a Venom fan. We had Alan Howarth on the show, who did the music for Halloween, Escape from New York, Poltergeist, They Live, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Gremlins, Star Trek, and more. We had Glenn Destructor from Australia's Destructor on the show. Witch Trap out of Colombia. The first interview we had on the Morgue, we had Pat from Hell Witch. We had Interceptor. We had Lee Harrison on from Monstrosity, Ex-Malevolent Creation, Ex-Terrorizer, Ex-Midnight. He was on here for 8 hours. We broke that up into 2 episodes. We had Perversifier on here from Miramac, Ancestral Fog, and Morte Incandescente on the show. We had Yuha on from Death Chain, Chamber of Light, and War Moon Lord. Yarno from Finland's Urn and Ex-Barathrum and Graves. Kev Desecrator from Destroyer 666, Sepulchre, Venefiction, and Profanation. We had Tony Thomas on from Witch Vomit and Torture Rack. W. Horror Preacher from Vomit Angel, Mask of Satan, and Witch's Hollow. We had Antion, a.k.a. Necroterror of Cadaveric Incubator, Ex-Torso Fuck, Ex-Sluggathor, and Satanic War Master. We had Nasty Ronnie on here from Nasty Savage. That's a 4-hour episode and definitely a deep dive into the Tampa Bay scene. We also had Chris Volcano on from Abominator, Cemetery Urn, Denouncement Pyre, and Ex-Destroyer 666. It was his first audio interview ever. Sadistic Fornicator and bassist The One of UK's Necromaniac. Revik of Mordant Red. We had Simo on from Finland's Flame and Exodorier. Daniel Avenger on the show from Nocturnal, Angel of Damnation, and Black Priest of Satan. Eric from Goat Seaman, Evil Dam, Ex-Sodom, and Ex-Black Angel. We had Sergeant Salston on from Deathhammer. We had Magnus on of Norway's Aberration, ex-Condor, ex-Hecatomb, and ex-Mayans Hill. We had Infernal and Odin on of Disaster. We had Alessio from Violenter, ex-Hobbs Angel of Death and the Mentors. Nige Rocket of Onslaught. Terry Butler of Obituary, Inhuman Condition, ex-Death, ex-Massacre, and Left to Die. Adam Scott of Cardiac Arrest. Noella of Hexea out of Texas. Crusher of Finland's Morgul. We had Lord Sabathan on from Slaughter Messiah, Heinous, ex-Dethroned, and ex-Morbid Death. Jesse Jolly of Malevolent Creation. We had Norway's Heimland on the show, Ritual Butcher of Finland's Arc-Goat, Yano with Anal Vomit out of Peru. We had Ronnie Palmer on from Perdition Temple and Malevolent Creation. We had John Berry on Slaughter Messiah, Ancient Rites, and Nocturnal. Udo from Accept. We had Tony Dolan on from Venom, Venom Inc., Adamcraft. Louisma from Hemorrhage and Depopulation Department. And again, these are just some of the guests you'll hear on the Tampa Morgue. You can go back and listen to them wherever you listen to your podcasts. Now I'm going to go over upcoming and new releases. Then we're going to do shows, and then we're going to get to our guest, Scott Burns. And we're going to start out with the French death metal band Rapture in Blood. They're putting out an album called God of Perversion. It's going to be self-released. Rapture in Blood formed in 2024. This will be the band's debut release. God of Perversion will have 8 tracks and come out May 2nd. And then we're going to go over to Abuser. They're a Polish thrash death metal band. They're putting out an album called Blood Marks on Extreme Music out of Spain. Abuser formed in 2018. The first release was a 2019 4-song demo. Blood Marks will have 10 songs. They also put out a video for Monument of Atrocity that will be on the Blood Marks record. And Blood Marks will be the band's debut full-length and be available May 7th on Extreme Music. Next, we're going to go over to the German thrash metal band Extinct. They're putting out an album called In Conspiracies We Trust. It's coming out on MDD Records out of Germany. Extinct formed in 2003. First release was a 2008 4-song demo. The band's debut full-length was titled Pain Palace that came out in 2013. They also put out an EP in 2021 titled Downward Spiral. In Conspiracies We Trust will be the band's third full-length and be available on May 7th. Then we're going to move over to the Finnish death metal band Wormlord. They're putting out an album called Choices. It's going to be self-released. Wormlord formed in 2019. First release was the 2023 debut full-length titled Open Wounds. Choices will have 9 tracks and be available May 8th. And then we're going to go over to the Seattle, Washington black death metal band Void Throne. They're putting out an album called Dreaming Rat on Total Dissonance Records. Void Throne formed in 2016. First release was their debut album, Spiritual War Tracks, that was also released in 2016. And Dreaming Rat will have 9 tracks and be available May 8th. Next, over to Indonesia and the brutal death metal band Vile Desolation. They're putting out an album called Annihilating the Consciousness. It's coming out on Comatose Records. Vile Desolation's first release was a 2024 2-song demo titled Shattered of Sanity. The band features members past and present of Death Artery, Discarnage, Agath, and Rotten Blood. And the debut full-length will have 10 tracks and be available on May 8th. And we're going to finish up the releases with the Italian death metal band Chronic Hate. Defeating the Oblivion of Life is the name of the record. It's coming out on Time to Kill Records out of Italy. Chronic Hate formed in 2001. Their first release was a 2004 demo titled Hate Line. They also put out 2 EPs, a live album, and Defeating the Oblivion of Life will be the band's third full-length. It'll have 9 tracks and be available on May 9th. And Webb, I'm going to do the shows, man, because your internet is not being friendly there, your Wi-Fi. So I'm going to take care of the shows. What do you think?
Yeah, and I couldn't tell you who was playing Tampa if you gave me money. So
That's
there's
right,
that,
man.
because I'm not there.
I'll just bang out the shows really fast. May 8th, Napalm Death at the Orpheum in Tampa with Dead Guy. And someone sent this show into me. Saturday, May 9th, Skin Harvest, Hate Tank, Severed Sun, and Decibel Dogs at the Brass Mug. $10 all ages. That's 1450 Skipper Road. Doors at 6:30 p.m. I'll announce also Alice Cooper Tuesday, May 5th at the Barbara B. Mann Performing Arts Hall in Fort Myers. And he'll also be playing May 6th in Fort Lauderdale at the Broward Center. So, Ed, that's what I have for shows. We'll have more shows we'll announce next week. I say we get to Scott Burns.
Yep, and we got to get to him because I got to get on stage here in a little bit and shred this fucking place.
And next week, we got Svartov from Nocturnal Breed and Gehenna coming on the show. So, yeah, we're going to get to Mr. Scott Burns. We're going to play some Overthrow. We're going to play Within Suffering from the Within Suffering record, another album that Scott Burns had worked on. Came out on Epidemic Records in 1990. They're a Canadian band. The only other release they put out was a demo in 89 called Bodily Domination. But we're going to play some Within Suffering from that record. And we'll be back on the Tampa Morgue with Scott Burns after this track.
For my suppression, can you think of rationality? Green fever alienates all my conscious thought. Enough of chill, little resistance, something must be done. Don't understand this feeling. Got to be lacking out of the place. Like a stable, sounding question, drop within, there's no mistake. Memory is flashed by, revealing a distorted past. Standing on the shadows of a damaged reality. Smith your mind to the prison. Manifest itself in thought disorder. Communication from mental function known as immune. Every action clipping you within your mind. Dominant power will take over, there is no cure.
Okay, that was Overthrow with Within Suffering, the 1990 album with the same name. And we are joined today by Mr. Scott Burns. How you doing, Mr. Burns?
I'm great, Tony. Thank you very much for having me on the Tampa Morgue, and it's a pleasure to be here.
God, it's awesome to have you on, man. And, I have to say, Scott, we all have paths that lead us to gateway bands in the 80s, as kids. For some, usually it starts out with the AC/DCs, the Kiss, the Sabbaths, the Metallicas, even then eventually Slayer, Venom, goes on from there. And my introduction to extreme metal came in 1990 on a compilation titled At Death's Door, a collection of brutal death metal that came out on RC Roadrunner Records. And there's no name credited more on that album than your name.
Yeah, I guess I did. I did a few records for Roadrunner and Monty. Yeah, I was quite lucky, and that's a good compilation for sure.
Yeah, you did 7 out of the 10 bands on there. You did X Order, obviously Death, which we're gonna talk about all that tonight, Malevolent Creation. Yeah, but that was a comp that introduced me to that kind of music. And, right away when I opened it, I was like, who is this? I was in New Jersey at this time period. And, for us over there, Tampa was a legend that, like, it was like this place that everybody wanted to visit. I moved to Tampa early 90s. I was, when I moved there, the only reason I was looking forward to move there was because of these kind of bands. Because, that comp was my introduction to Deicide and then a lot of those bands. But do you remember that comp? And do you remember, like, are you surprised looking back now, all these years later, what an impact it had?
Oh, I definitely remember the compilation, the Roadrunner put out and the bands and I mean, once again, is I'll just say this is there were just so many bands around and you know, I think for people today is it's difficult to imagine or realize that it was very much underground back then. I mean, it wasn't the big heyday like now where everybody just says, "Hey, death metal." People were still people were still digging a lot of thrash and, power metal and stuff, which is great, but the death metal stuff very much was still on the underground, and I mean, once again, I think it's a testament to the Tampa scene and just the Florida scene and all the bands from like I said, even though they weren't straight death metal, Nasty Savage, and then go back to Sabotage before them, these bands influenced the band so much. And Chuck, he came back from California, and then down south they had Malevolent and Cynic and stuff. But I think it was just, obviously Morbid Angel, Deicide, Cannibal Corpse, blah, blah, I mean, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, but there were so many bands around, and everyone used to drive up to see shows at the Brass Mug or all the places, Sunset Club and stuff like that. And, you know, I think it was like I said, I'm not saying everybody was like best friends, but everybody was friendly and friends, and everybody was like who can play faster, who can blast better, you know what I mean, or who can write the sickest riffs. And it was just it was a good time, it was definitely a scene. And I was lucky to be a part of it and so it was a lot of fun and you know that's it, but it was great.
We would do want to talk to you tonight about some of those releases, and I want to talk a little bit about your history too. I know you've heard the show before. That's kind of what we usually do is kind of dissect the person a little bit. And you were born in Missouri and moved to the area in the Tampa area at 3 years old.
Yes, that's correct, about 3 or 4, but I live west, I'm in Pinellas County, and so Tampa's east of me. Yep, but I mean, I'm close enough, just like, say, for instance, Atheist is south of the bridge, so they're about as far to Tampa as from my house, and, uh, Deicide, Amon, they were on my side of the bay, Pinellas County, so, I mean, you have to remember that it's not like, you said you're a Jersey guy, it's not as populated as up northeast or stuff, so people drove a little bit further, just like coming up from Lauderdale and stuff, Miami area, like I said, but, I've been here my entire life, yes.
And what brought you to Florida was your grandfather worked on a fishing pier, which I know these fishing piers because I know where you go and you see the photos of the people with the fish that all hang up with the dates on them and stuff like that. And your grandfather was a photographer at one of these.
Yeah, he was. I mean, basically, my grandpa liked to drink, and he was a great guy, Elmer, and he got a divorce from my grandma, and he liked to fish, and so he somehow moved down here, and his job was he took the money at the fishing pier, your toll, and then they didn't have advertising back in the day, and I remember just when I was a little kid, and he had a Polaroid camera, so he would just take a picture like Tony caught a redfish and it was 5 pounds, and he would write on the bottom like your name, Tony, and then he would say like 5 pound redfish and the date. And then they just had some shitty plexiglass, case, and people would walk up and say like, "Oh, they're catching redfish, or they're catching trout, or they're catching snook, or grouper, tarpon," and that was the advertising. And it was a simple life, and that's what he did. And so, well, my mom followed him down. We did, and my parents were divorced, and So, I had, like I said, obviously this is when I was 3, I had no fucking clue, but, I mean, as I got older and stuff, but that's how we ended up down here, and everybody thought, "You're crazy to move." My northern relatives all thought, I guess my mom would say that they thought we're crazy because all you have in Florida is cockroaches and alligators and mosquitoes.
Those palmetto
So,
bugs, yeah.
yeah, palmetto bug, right, you know it, yeah, palmetto bugs is better name than cockroaches, so, but that's how we ended up here, and I've been here, forever, and that's it, so,
And if you don't mind me asking, man, what year were you born?
1963.
63. And, were you the normal, like, little league kid and stuff like that, that you were involved with the sports and stuff like that at a young age?
I played baseball for sure. I always liked baseball. I played football a little bit, but I wasn't super, super athletic, so they stuck me on the offensive line and then, I didn't get that big. So I only played football a couple years and stuff. And I played soccer and stuff. I mean, I like sports, but you know, I always played band. I was in band. I played trombone for like 10 years. You know what I mean? Up through high school. So maybe that's some musicality, but I always liked music. And I think, attribute it to my mom. She was always playing like AM radio stuff, Motown or whatever, and just AM radio. And then as I, got older, just hanging out with friends, like an older brother of mine, older friend of mine, his older brother, his buddy was in a band and they played like UFO and stuff and listening to Black Sabbath. But I mean, that was, like I said, as I was 13, so you can put it way back. But, like I said, is rock and roll and things like that and heavy hard rock or, I guess Sabbath was the only thing that was, but I had no idea about heavy metal or whatever, anything when I was 12, 13. It was just, like I said, hard rock or whatever and rock and roll. And I guess the one thing I'll go back to say is that in Florida, it's always been a more rock oriented or, you know what I mean? It's not progressive or whatever, but like, contemporary music, rock and roll has always been big, like, Crocus played here 52 times. Like, I saw Thin Lizzy open up for uh, Tom Petty and stuff
Nice.
like that. I mean, and saw UFO open up for Rush. I mean, so the rock bands, the hard rock, metal bands always came around and stuff. So it's always been a big thing. So I guess, just living here, you grew up on rock and roll.
What was your first concert that you attended?
Hmm. Well, believe it or not, Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Oh, there you
My
go.
my friend's sister, was big into them, and we went and obviously we couldn't drive, so her mom took us to see them. I mean, I think I saw, like, my parents took me to see, like, Neil Diamond at Tampa Stadium. I couldn't go see Led Zeppelin game, but I was too young, and my mom wouldn't let me go over with my friends, and, but I think Emerson, Lake and Palmer was the first, like, thing, and you know what I mean, before, like I said, I was driving and stuff like that, but, yep. So anyway,
You talked about you mentioned the radio and stuff. When you were in Tampa, what was 70s, right? What is it like, Q105, 98 Rock was, I think, just starting at that time period, WSF and stuff?
absolutely, like 98 Rock for sure, Russ Album James and Q105, you hit the nail on yep, and for alternative music or whatever, there was M&F, which was 88.5, and, 89.7, which was USF, but Uh, those were primarily the rock FM stations for sure. Like, they used to play whole sides of albums. Like, you could hear Led Zeppelin 4 played through its entirety or Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon. You know what I mean? And they used to do that stuff occasionally or quite often, but it was more AOR, album oriented rock. And, even skipping forward is, but the studio back in the day, they used to do stuff where they would, because they had an ISDN line, digital line before everything, and, that's how, like, Ozzy came and, did a Westwood One and stuff, and all the they would broadcast that through, I think, 98 Rock and stuff like that, where the bands would show up and they would talk and do an interview, and then they would broadcast it out, 'cause it was harder to do way back in the day with the quality, right? Now everything's good quality, but back in the day, it cost a lot of money to have a dedicated line that sounded good.
What was it do you remember, like, the first record that you actually personally owned or purchased with your own cash?
Yeah, it's a good one. Well, I don't know. I can remember, like, being super young with my cousins and, like, they bought, uh, Deep Purple Machine Head, Ziggy Stardust, and, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Those were probably, like, the first records that I sat around and listened to way back when I was, like, I don't know, 9 or 10 or something like that I can recall, and, but and then just buying records and stuff, like I said, then I'd listen to stuff with my friend's older brother, and then just ordering stuff off those bullshit, what is it, the RCA, record clubs or whatever, where you get
For a
10 and
penny?
you put a penny and put them under a bogus name and crap like that, but a lot of cassettes and stuff like that, but, yeah, so like I said, is I really liked UFO, Thin Lizzy as a young man, Rush, you know, all that stuff. Judas Priest, some of it I liked more than others, but I mean, just rock and roll for sure. Zeppelin, I mean, anything, Hendrix, I mean, anything that was rock and Fog Hat. I mean, it does anything that was rock and roll back in the days, I liked more than anything. So.
Where were you picking up your records at? 'Cause back then, I believe it was like Rock Bar, Camelot, right in the '80s, Bananas Music, which is still rolling. Where were you going?
Yeah, they had bananas, I remember that. There was peaches. Um, there was a place in Dunedin, this is getting older when I, like, started listening to a lot of punk rock stuff when I was, like, 16, 17. But because I started listening to a lot of punk, uh, record and tape outlet in Dunedin, this older couple, Renee and Perry, and they were cool, and they'd order stuff, and, but no, like you said, bananas, they were big peaches, and then the stuff at the malls and stuff, and there was Asylum Music down in St.
Yeah.
Pete, and, I'm trying to think is
Asylum's still there, but it's totally different now.
yeah, it's like a smoke shop or
Yeah.
something now, I think, but yeah, it's got the same logo, but yeah, I mean, it definitely was difficult. You had to drive or mail order or stuff. You had to go to somewhere to find it, and it was harder to find, stuff. I mean, Dan Johnson and I were talking about this, that, like, we were just all I think basically I'll say this is I think most of us started off as just being fans and record collectors, right? We bought records
Yep.
to listen to stuff, and it was stuff that you couldn't really find so much. So you went out and sought it out and stuff like that. So you just kind of drove around, or sometimes you'd order it and stuff like that. And uh, like I said, it was a different era. I mean, I'm just an old fuck now, so all the young kids got it made because you can just stream anything and
In
hear
5
everything
seconds. You get
5 seconds. It's amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, you're right, 'cause, I remember we talk about this a lot on the show too. You'd line up with your listen to the radio, you have, like, your blank tape, you're trying to catch the song when it starts, end it when it's over without getting commercials, 'cause that's the way you can get songs off the radio when you're a kid if you don't can't afford the record, or, um
absolutely.
yeah, I mean, were you familiar with Aces? Did you know Frank, or I don't know if you went in there at
Sure.
all?
Yeah, that was all yep, and then he was in the beginning, he was out at the, Oldsmar Flea
Yeah.
Market. No, Frank was amazing and stuff like that. Like I said, that's a little later for me, though, I mean, by the time, but yep, no, he was definitely big, and, Tony and Dave from No Clubs, I mean, you have to give them a big shout out because they did a lot of punk bands, post-punk bands, but they did metal bands, but they did everything underground and stuff like that, but, people like Frank and stuff like that definitely brought records around to people that wanted to seek it out besides just top 40 radio, you know what I mean? And that's a thing that was hard was, like I said, is, I mean, to divert off that, like I said, is like, back with Borovoy from Blabbermouth. I mean, he was in tune to everything. His friend, uh, you know, Catherine Ludwig from Metal Maniacs, you would pick up that magazine or some magazines or the fanzines and stuff like that. It just really, like I said, is you had to not not to make it sound like you're something special, but you had to be a diehard or something. You know what I mean? You had to go seek it out. In other words, like today, like you just said, is you can click through Spotify or anything, I guess, and you can find everything, and you can go to anything, and people will play you a clip. Hey, listen to our stuff, but it wasn't like that back in the day. It was difficult. It was more difficult to find stuff, and news didn't travel that fast, as they say.
No, you're right, and, we're mentioning even you look at Aces, look at some of the people that you had James Murphy work there at one time, Brian
Oh, yeah,
Kenyon,
yeah.
David Vincent, Trevor, I mean, there's a lot of history there back when I think it started over on Fowler, like, the early '90s, '92 probably,
Yes,
you
no, it
know
was Fowler, but he was even before then, he was at a flea market
Yep.
selling s
Was it
yeah, so,
Oldsmore?
yeah, yes, yeah. But I think, like you said, it's just difficult now. I mean, back then, it took a while to find out and just to see what was going on. Whereas nowadays, I mean, I think the thing that's probably more difficult for a newer band is that there's so much stuff coming out. Like before, maybe you'd read like the hype of a new record coming out, like say an Overthrow or some band on At Death's Door, Gorguts or somebody, and you may not have heard of them, but you just read about them and you heard what they're like, or somebody or the demo was out there trading. You had cassettes and stuff like that, or your buddy made a copy of a copy of a copy and sent it to you. But, so you may have to wait, but nowadays it's just instantaneous, like you said.
Yeah, it's a totally different world. And even the shows back then, you think about in that area, you had like avatars playing at the Kmart in Clearwater, like in like '82. I mean, that's insane, and the roller skating rink shows, right? There was those going on and stuff. Was Mark Twain's, Mr. T's. There were so many places that aren't around anymore. Um, you know,
Yeah, Mark.
yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
Mark Twain, Mr. T, yeah.
yeah,
That's funny.
the mining club, right, in Pinellas and
Yeah,
stuff.
49th Street Mining Company. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned I know you're a big Shankner fan too, which I mean is he's another one that's awesome, and you're also Steely Dan too.
I love Steely Dan. I mean, they have more great guitar solos. Every song has a great guitar solo. I mean, all the cats they had play with them. I mean, I know it's a different cup of tea for some people, but I mean, maybe that's why like I can handle technical music is I love Steely Dan as much as anything. And I mean, the guitar solos are incredible. Walter Becker and then all the guys they had play with them. I mean, everybody, the session guys, but there are a lot of great solos. I mean, uh, I but yeah, but going back to the mining company, you know what I mean? There were so many places around rock bands playing. We had like at the studio, Morrisound, like Stranger, they got a major label deal. They would draw like, you know, they were a local bar band. They were huge. They would draw 600 people, 700 people a night at a bar. Imagine that. I mean,
Yeah.
nowadays, I mean, fuck, man, nobody goes to see live music nowadays. Like, these are just before they were signed. I mean, you know what I mean? And Executioner and stuff. I mean, if they drew 100, 200 people, that was amazing or something like that back in the day. But there were rock bands around doing, that we recorded that, Jim and Tom did that just, I mean, were big back in the day, the rock scene. It was, and that was local. Everybody went to see. That's one thing that's different is everybody went out to see local live music, whether it was death metal or hard rock or whatever. But it was, like I said, it's just live music was a different thing than nowadays. You know what I mean? I guess, the times have changed and that's okay, but, you know, it's just different.
I think, that has to do too with, like, you think about it now, you miss a show that happened last night, that there's a 90% chance you can go on YouTube and watch that shit the next day, which, back then it wasn't like that. You had to go to, like, I remember, well, even growing up in Jersey before I moved to Tampa in the early '90s, you'd have to go buy, like, VHS tapes of the shows at, like, these metal shops and stuff like that, totally different. Um you
Yeah,
you mentioned some of those bands too, like The Strangers, you had Brat, Argus, Siren
right.
back then. They were kind of the before, like, you're talking, because '84 you have Hell Witch is putting out demos, and obviously you have, Nasty Savage putting out the Wage demo, but back then, those were the bands, right, pretty much, that were circulating?
Absolutely, Brat, they were big. I mean, like I said, more like in the Motley Crue or Bane and all that, but yeah, all those Argus, sure, you know what I mean? It was, you know, I mean, Sabotage was Avatar. I mean, but yeah, I mean, definitely there wasn't, that was the style much more than the extreme stuff. I mean, like I said, you know what I mean? Even even to go back to Sabotage, I mean, they were heavy and about as heavy as you could get for being probably commercial, but they were still definitely on the outside. You know what I mean? And you mentioned like VCR tapes. I'll say this is I don't know if it exists anymore out there, but there's a show where Executioner, I think it's the Sunset Club, played, and they opened for Death. And I mean, they built their own stage, and Big Daddy, their lighting guy, sound guy, I think he managed them for years. He's been a good friend. I don't know, I mean, in what capacity he's with them anymore now. It's been so long, but they had urns with flash bombs, and they had, as we have Spanish moss and the
Yeah.
oak trees that hang, and they they put on a show, and there's VHS tape of it. That it's just amazing for kids that were 15, 16 years old. I mean, to think of the creativity that they did to do that. All I can say is if you can imagine the back of the Slowly We Rot cover that, you know, Tim Hubbard capture where they did those Big Daddy did them flash bombs for that and stuff is but I mean, these guys back then they all did these great shows, but it's like you were saying, Tony, is you can't find it. It's probably very difficult to find or it's grainy because there was no YouTube back in the day.
Yeah, and, piggybacking off what you just said, I heard that there was you could probably confirm this, back then, there was even bands that asked Executioner to tone it down a little bit, that they were opening up for them because they were kinda, not stealing the show, but kinda stealing the show.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And I mean, like, I think on that first SOS tour with Sepultura, Obituary, and Sadist, they weren't allowed to do I mean, some of it was due to the clubs and stuff like that, but I think absolutely that, management in on some of the acts, you know what I mean? Because they did all that stuff, it looked, you know, pretty professional for an opening band compared to some of the bands. So I think, not threatened, but perhaps they thought you know, it wasn't, for an opening band, they have to wait their turn or something like that. But no, I think there's truth in that statement, Tony, for sure.
And also you mentioned, we mentioned Tim Hubbard, which obviously you went to school with him, and you were both into skating, obviously, Tim as a skateboarder also, and I gotta say too, man, just that, photo exhibit was awesome at the Metal Museum, that was set up for him, it was great, but you were also into punk, as you mentioned, what was it like, the Black Flags, I don't know if you were into the Dwarves, Gangrene and stuff like that, or what was some of the bands you were getting into?
Well, I liked all of it. I mean, the one thing, so yeah. So anyway, Crass, Fluxa Pink Indians, UK Subs, Black Flag, Fear, you name it, Circle Jerks, anything. I mean, Decline of the Western Civilization, the whole movie. I just thought, even some of the X, Sushi, Bauhaus. I mean, I just having said all that about growing up with all the rock stuff, the one thing that I ended up not liking so much was because how with AOR, how pompous, and it was like, you know, I just thought it got too much where it was these big rock star bands and stuff, and I really kinda didn't like that, and I just remember seeing the Sex Pistols on TV one time, and I thought that was really cool, like in '76 or something like that, so I really liked that whole do it yourself and the fucks is maybe the anarchistic, society or fuck your parents. Maybe it's just a rebellion thing when you're a kid. I mean, eventually I thought that, one thing I didn't like was, especially this is later with recording, is that, sometimes with the punk bands that still love the spirit and stuff like that, but it didn't seem like they rehearsed or practiced or much. So sometimes the more punk came around, it just seemed to be hit and miss, is like party and get fucked up and play. And I don't mean that sounds bad to say because I still love punk, but I just meant is that I think, that was the one thing that I really was impressed with the death metal guys is because, like I said, is it really wasn't in my wheelhouse. Like I can remember telling Tim, like, from working with the Executioner, just being an assistant and things like that at the studio and stuff was like, these guys make Waddy from the Exploited. John Tardy makes Waddy sound like, nothing, like mellow. And I just never heard anything like that extreme. And that's the thing I liked about them was that, they were extreme. They weren't pretentious. They were just regular guys that go smoke a bowl, drink a beer, and hang out. And we all like similar style musics, and then they turned me on to more stuff because, like I said, it really wasn't in my wheelhouse, but I think that's the one thing I really did dig about the death metal scene and the heavy thrash scene was that how much those guys really practiced, and at a young age, they were into it. It just wasn't like, "Hey, let's go get fucked up and play," which is cool. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm all for art and doing whatever. But overall is I just was really impressed how hard these guys played and how disciplined they were and how extreme it was. Because like I said, it was more extreme than any of the punk stuff I ever heard. You know what I mean? So I thought that was cool.
And we always talk about it on the show too. I mean, I don't know, is there a better death metal vocalist than John Tardy? I mean, I don't know. I mean, even I mean, there's great death metal vocalists, but that voice, I mean, and it's perfect. I mean, if it should be in the dictionary. See death metal vocals. I always felt, even as a kid, that John Tardy. I was a big fan of the early Benton records, also. But yeah, I mean, Tardy's just amazing.
He is. I mean, once again, it's difficult to say he's the best, but he is the best. Like I said, you can say Glenn's the best. You can say Corpse Grinder's the best. You can pick, but the thing is that as a fan, you pick who you think is the best. But I will say this is, it's like chocolate, strawberry, vanilla. Everybody has a favorite, but he's the fucking man. He was unfucking believable. I mean, like I said, I'll never forget the first time I heard him. I was like, what the fuck is this? I was like, like I said, it made everything I heard in punk rock sound mellow. I was like, he was so extreme. And and he was such a cool guy to boot. I mean, like I said, he's like you would expect like some guy all drugged out on meth or something to be that, but I mean, he's totally mellow, like, "Hey man, how you doing?" Whatever. But no, you're right, like I said, all those guys pick your flavor. They were killer. They still are killer. I mean, that was the beauty of it.
And when you hear Tardy, you just know it's him. It's kind of yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that became the problem to me with the death metal scene eventually was, you know, you could pick out the guy, okay, he sounds like John Tardy, or there's a Trevor Peres riff, you know what I mean? Or there's the Trey riff, the Morbid Angel riff. You know what I mean? You could start to pick out all the bands that were influenced by the bands, and yet those bands still existed. And the same thing happened with, like with Metallica and stuff, and the thrash bands, and some of the guys that would come in is, you could pick out the riffs and say, hey, these, it's a killer riff. But I think, Metallica or Megadeth or Overkill or Annihilator or whoever has already probably done this. Testament, has probably done this before somewhat. So, I mean, that's a difficult thing to overdo when the bands that you love are still popular.
And you started noticing that too, right? Towards the end of your career doing that, you started noticing like the originality was kind of gone, right? You had a lot of, kind of like you see in any kind of movement, everybody wants to sound like this, or, when the grunge thing happened, every band started wearing flannel shirts, or you started noticing this also?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I talked to, when Gehlke did the book about me, made the joke. I mean, we talked about Euronymous and how like I got put on the back of the album and everything
No
was, you
core,
know what
no
I mean?
metal.
Yeah, and I think the guy's a genius. He's dead now. I mean, never at the time I thought he's a fucking asshole, probably, but at the same time, is that's the beauty of punk rock and of the black metal scene or anything, that they realized that the scene's getting old, right? That it's no longer somehow getting vibrant. I mean, I hate to say this, some of the guys will probably give me shit, but in other words, is that things aren't, you know what I mean? Maybe things are getting stale and someone needs to try something different. Now, I'm not saying the good bands need to try anything different, but I'm saying is that's a sign of when a scene is probably getting past maturity and getting older, is when everybody starts copying themselves. And I think that's just human nature with any scene, like you said, with grunge or pick any, I mean, anything. But like I said, is yes, it was easy to see that. And there were fewer and fewer bands. There were still good bands, great bands, but it was harder and harder, you know what I mean? Because, like I said, perhaps they just weren't quite as original as the other ones. And, maybe it's just a sense of timing and all that. I don't know. But like I said, is a lot of great bands, but yes, everything plays itself out, right? I mean,
Definitely. And you mentioned you played trombone as a kid for many years, and you also attempted bass at one time.
yeah, but I sucked. I mean, I really wasn't. I mean, that's how I ended up doing live sound was, my friends had like a punkish band, post-punk band, and they needed somebody to do sound. And so I started doing sound for them. You know what I mean? Because, I mean, I wasn't good enough to play bass even. And, um, and that's it. But no, I mean, like I said, is I wasn't very good at all.
What was that band's name, if you don't mind me asking?
There's a band, they're called Dialogue.
Hello. And you actually do have some credits I do wanna mention too. You have some, vocal or spoke or voice credits, during your work. You did Solstice 1992, the self-titled record you, have a credit for. Demolition Hammer, Tortured Existence record from 1990 you have a credit for. Crypta from Puerto Rico from 1995's album, Violently Dedicated, you have a credit for that. Anomaly, which was, Sean Malone, right? And Sean Reiner. You have a credit for that on the self-released, and then Rumble Militia, 1991 Stop Violence and Madness record. You also have credits on.
Yeah, but I mean, that's just gang vocal. I mean, not to discredit it, but it's just gang vocal stuff. It could have been anybody.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
You can't pick anything out. I mean, I couldn't sing the I mean, I couldn't sing to save my life, so.
yeah. We've actually had. I worked with Mark Prater a lot on a couple of the records I did, and we've had,
Oh, nice.
and we'll talk about Prater here in a few minutes. A very good friend of mine, and yeah, we've forced him to go into the booth and do some stuff for us too. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And you mentioned
Absolutely.
that, yeah, Mark's a great guy. But you
Yes.
memory running sound, but pre-stepping into more sound, what are some of the venues you're working in? And I know you did sound for Executioner at times, like Nasty Savage. And did you enjoy doing sound at shows? And yeah, again, what are some of the venues you're doing it at? Some of the bands you're doing it for?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, like I said, I just for my friend's band, dialogue and stuff, and then so that's dovetailed into how they won like some battle of the bands, and we got to record and went to a studio. And I thought that was really cool because it was more of a controlled environment. Um, and that's how I ended up like they wanted to do a 7-inch, and then there's a band, Pagan Faith, hardcore band, punk band from Tampa, and I do sound for them, and I got a hold of them, and the deal was, once again, I mean, it's pretty well documented, but I went around to the studio that we won the competition for was really not so good,
What
and
studio
so
was
I
that?
I think it was called Hayes Recording, and they no offense to the guy, the engineer, I mean, he probably he knew what he was doing back then. Or I have to remember is like, I was probably 20 years, 18, 19, 20 years old or something. But they mainly, a lot of the studios in town just did jingles, right? Like, commercial songs, stuff like that. There wasn't a big market in Tampa for recording original or rock or any kind of music like that. So they mainly did jingles. But so anyway, I went there and liked it, but I didn't like the experience with the guy because, like I said, we were kind of punk band and he really didn't like it and stuff. But that's how I went around, and that's how I found Morrisound. And I was like, wow, these guys, Jim and Tom and Rick Miller, they're the shit. And so I made a deal with the bands. I would say like, hey, I'll pay half, you pay half, and then Jim and Tom and Rick will make sure I don't fuck it up too bad. And then we'll get a decent recording and I'll learn. So I would pay half, they would pay half, and then we put out some 7 inches and stuff like that. And then I ended up getting they needed an assistant uh, started needing an assistant at night. So I just started being an assistant engineer. But I did like doing live sound at the time. Like I did like, the Armory in Tampa did a show, like Nasty Savage opened for Impaler. And, like I said, the Executioner and them, they were smaller, like the Sunset Club and Brass Mug, and these were small places. I mean, none of these places were big, and the PA we had, like, I would do some, I remember I did sound for the Circle Jerks one time, and they said it was like the worst sound they ever had at the Cuban Club in the early '80s. And, but anyway, because our PA was so small and they were a big band, right? But that was punk rock back in the day, right? I mean, and, but anyway, there are no clubs to mention of any noticeable. Like I said, the biggest thing was probably like Savage when they opened for Impaler at the, Armory. But, it was fun and I liked it, but I liked the controlled environment better just because back then, nowadays, I mean, everything's much different, but, back then it really was, you had a Kelsey board, you had a 18 subwoofer, a pair of 12s and some tweeters and stuff like that, and some monitors, and you just tried to make it sound good. But, you had a 16-channel Snake, and that was about it.
And early on, you mentioned Morrisound, obviously, it's 83-ish, you're going in there, and Jim, Tom, and Rick Miller, who unfortunately passed away in 2017, and I heard you credit, Jim and Tom, which is, again, documented that they were, like, some basically geniuses, right? I know, and then Rick Miller was the guy who created the 8-channel mixer.
Yeah, well, yes, it did. I mean, Rick had electrical engineer and Jim and Tom, yeah, they were way ahead. I mean, because the original studio on Nebraska wasn't or Florida, it wasn't very big. I mean, the A room, like where Executioner started, I mean, it was probably like 8 foot by 12 foot to record drums, and everything still sounded amazing. And I mean, everything sounded, that was the one thing when you went in there. I mean, listen, when I went in there to hear stuff, like to check them out, they didn't play me death metal or anything. They probably played me some rock and roll, Bobby Friss or Stranger or something, or the USF jazz band or something like that. It was just all quality. But you could tell these guys, they knew. I mean, I'll say this. I'm not the smartest guy, but I figured out right away these guys know what the fuck they're doing. And they were just cool. And like I said, I learned everything from them. I mean, like, I wouldn't have known anything without them. Uh, for sure is. And like you mentioned is, they built their own 8-channel mixer. So, back in the day when it was a long, long time ago, you had to have, you would ask the engineer and he would do a mix and give you a 2-channel stereo bus out of all the whatever was on tape, right? So drums, he would mix down the drums and then he'd put some guitar in there and bass and blah, blah, keyboards, whatever. And you got that mix and that's basically how you listen. Well, the problem is in the studio, the bass player saying, fuck you, I can't hear my bass. The guitarist saying, I can't hear this. The drummer saying, I can't hear this. Everybody's bitching about the mix because they had the same mix. So maybe you had 2 or 3 outs and you could give them separate mixes, but still. So Jim and Tom and Rick, they said, let's make our own 8-channel mixer. So they would give you 8 channels out. So basically we would mix down the drums because in other words, everybody can get a pretty good drum mix, right? And mix that into 2. And then, 1 track for the bass, 1 track for one guitar, 1 track for another guitar, keyboard, sax player, whatever. But you had 8 channels because most of the time you really weren't, you know what I mean? So that was a big deal back in the day because nobody had that stuff. And like I said, eh, Tom, he had a master's degree, worked at I forget DuPont or Dow Chemical, and he knew how to make, he made the rooms so they, you could liven them up, deaden them up, everything. I just mean is that, they all had degrees in electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, and they just were light years ahead. And I think, to switch for a second but that's how the whole thing really started was they had this great studio and then Dan Johnson, he comes in and he's got Avatar and he's doing sirens back in the day. And I mean, like I said he was, young guy, record producer, owned his, I should say record producer at the time. He was just a young guy starting out who wanted to produce a record and said, fuck it, I'm going to do it. And so he signed Avatar and whatever. I don't know all the details and stuff. And I mean, you know, there's Sabotage, right? There's Avatar, Sirens, Dungeons Are Calling.
Oh,
And
great,
then,
great.
he knew, like I said, then he got like I said, he knew the guy from Noise, I guess Carl Walter Bach, Coroner, Agent Steel, Whiplash, Roadrunner. I mean, he put out Crimson Glory, Damage. I mean, he was doing all this work, so I would be an assistant. Jim and Tom would be the engineers, or I, like with Death, I would engineer with Leprosy. But once again, you have to give Dan a lot of credit because like Jim and Tom had all these tools on how to record metal and make it sound great and hard rock. And then, Dan had all these contacts with these labels and it just worked. And I mean, it was amazing because like I said, is that, it just like everything, it just kind of spread by word of mouth, I guess, because there wasn't that many places around. There was the Testament guy was up, Perry Alice, I guess, was up in,
Alex Perry Ellis.
yep, in Ithaca, New York. Randy Burns out in California. You know, I guess there were, obviously the Metallica guys were using their own guy, but I mean, that was a way different league. But I'm just saying is there wasn't that many places around. And that's what, once again, not to sound like an old fuck, but to all the young people is nowadays you guys just Dropbox everything or whatever and
Exactly.
send fucking WAV files. I mean, you couldn't do that back in the day, right? You had half-inch tape 2-inch tape, and I mean, you had to go to a good studio. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. Otherwise, you just sounded like you were recording out of a fucking boombox. So you had to go find Morrisound. You had to go find the big studios that sounded good because you really didn't have a lot of choice.
And how many bands now don't even and have never jammed together, that they put out albums, they just, "Here's a file, here's a file." It is the way today. Um, and Morrisound at that time period, the crew was what? Judd Packer, Roger Stefan, Mark Prater, who we mentioned a couple minutes ago,
Yeah.
Brian Ben Scouter, and Steve Heritage, who was also the guitarist and vocalist for the band Assuck, which was mentioned here in a few minutes. But I do want Dan Johnson, it's kind of a crazy story with Dan too, because he started with Par Records, right? With his wife had slipped on some grapes or something like that, and that began his journey. But the Dungeons Are Calling. So is that hit? So I've heard the slamming of the door on the first track. That was him slamming a studio door?
Yeah, Jim recorded that because we had big, heavy doors, and, I don't know how Jim exactly did it, but, I mean, they're big, heavy doors because they were soundproof with wood and stuff, and no, I mean, that'll live in infamy that you know what I mean? The rack waits for me. I
Yeah.
mean, so, yeah, but Jim came up with I mean, they had that idea, and then Jim put it to work, and Dan said, you know but yeah, it's amazing. But,
When I hear
like I
that song,
said
I think of that now. There's no way to get that out of my head. When I hear that tune, I think of it's a studio door at Morrisound being slammed.
yeah. No, yeah. I mean, like I said, a lot of those things that, they come up with that Dan will say, "Hey, let's try this. Let's come up with this idea," or whatever, and, Jim and Tom would figure out a way to do it, or John Oliva would say, to do something. But yeah, that was the beauty is those guys could figure out everything. And, you know, I I don't, I'll say this is I have to give a lot of these younger people credit. Like, this gentleman, Arthur Risk, right? I mean, he's done everything on his own. I think like there's a gentleman up in Orlando, uh, Jason Sukoff. I think he has his own studio. You know, Jared Pritchard up in Orlando, even Eric Rutan, and I mean, I'm sure there's
Savannah.
zillions of guys that I don't know, but I think that those guys, I have to tip my hat to them because they did it all on their own. I worked at a bigger studio where I got to watch a lot of really good people and learn from them. And so to me, I've always been impressed with that from talking and hearing about these guys. Like I said, obviously this is much later on after I've been retired, but these guys all figured it out on their own. I don't know if I would have done that. Like I said, I sat around and watched these guys get sounds and figure out how to do stuff and then worked on it on my own. But like I said, I had, the best studio, the only, I'll say this, it's been the only state-of-the-art studio in Tampa Bay ever, period. End of story. I'm not saying that because I worked there. It wasn't another studio that was more sound. I mean, Tom and Jim, they did everything. Like, when the fucking Super Bowl came to Tampa Bay, right, each time, when they needed to record audio, who would the NFL call? Tom. Right? And they would do whatever there. I mean, they weren't calling anybody down the street, and that's not to disparage anybody, but that's how good Morrisound was, is everyone, no matter what style of music you wanted to record, if you wanted, world-class recording, you would go there.
Yeah, and you had many. I mean, obviously, you sat through a lot of early on, what, 83 through 87, I'm Rat Cafeteria you're doing, right? There's 7 Inches and stuff like that, and a lot of the punk bands and stuff. And there's also, while you're recording albums there, which we're gonna talk about some of the albums now in a minute, many bands are also hanging. I know Dave Allison was helping out a lot with taking the bands around and stuff like that. We know Dave, awesome, metal museum that he runs over in Tampa each year now, which is a, great event.
Absolutely. Dave
Yeah.
was always around.
Yeah, Dave was like, taking bands out and, helping out with that kind of stuff and everything, and he's obviously a figure in the Tampa Bay scene for all of us there, but, you also had a lot of people wanting to hang out there, right? 'Cause you even had when you guys did the, Inhuman Condition EP for Massacre in '92, it had Cronus in there, right, from Venom. He actually flew into town. Do you remember that?
Yeah, yeah, barely, but yes, he did. He was very nice, and everybody just used to, if they were on vacation, it was like like I said, because there wasn't that many places. If somebody was in town, they'd stop by or whatever. Yes, I mean that was quite often. A lot of tourists. I mean, obviously not as famous as him, but a lot of fans or whatever would just show up because there wasn't that many studios around, right? I mean, you know, and and I think we were most of not so much for me, I mean, I was open to it, but all the bands were like you said, Dave Allison, there was, the Vernon Blake, I mean, there's a guy, Ken Carnig, to name a few. There were a list of people that always hung around that were fans. Maybe they had weed or they would take you out to shows, but they were genuine fans and they would, you know, uh, as long as the bands were always if the bands were cool with it, then we were cool with it, so it was pretty much an open door policy.
We mentioned, Steve Heritage earlier. You produced Assuck's 1991 Anti-Capital record, and then you also did the '92 and '93 EPs and '97's, Misery Index record. You enjoyed working with that band because it was kind of a little bit of a change for you from the usual.
Well, yeah, I mean, me and Steve yeah, because we had more of a punk rock, grindcore background, I mean, and he's like a brother to me. I mean, I just talked to him today. I talk to him probably once a week, but, yeah, no, I mean, he was a good guy. I mean, Tom was looking for an assistant, and I said, "Hey, let's, give him a try." And, to be honest, they were a little weary of a guy with spray painted blue hair, mohawk, and stuff. But he was a great guy, and no, I liked, I liked the fact that they were outside, like with Skeletal Earth. I mean, they were, at the time. Assuck really wasn't that popular. It was really more underground. If you say death metal was underground, the grind scene and stuff like that, besides Napalm and some of the bigger bands, whatever, but Assuck was, you know, still finding their way or whatever. But now they've seemed, you know what I mean, with history, uh,
Legend
gotten
grows.
legend grows. But no, they were cool. I mean, he wanted to do stuff 20-second songs. Rob Proctor, he played with Nasty Savage for a little while, super fast. I mean, just extreme stuff. And like I said, it's back to the punk stuff. Like I said, is I was okay with everything. Like I said, is you know what I mean? Just you know, it's not my business to decide and let them play. And they were extreme, and it was good.
And you mentioned Rob Proctor. I know he, got an engineering degree, at the University of Florida, and he actually has credited you for, influencing him in that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's funny. I mean, he was always a smart guy, and he's a big, he's like a head at Rolls-Royce up in. I talked to him in Indianapolis up in working on jet engines, and he's a metallurgical engine, mechanical engineer, metallurgy. Sorry, and but no, I mean they were smart guys, and like I said, most of the guys in the band are smart guys. So no, he was a good guy, and they, like I said, it was a good time.
I'm gonna play a track from the Anti-Capital album. Now I'm gonna play Socialized Crucifixion, and we'll be back with Scott Burns after this track from Assuck. that was Assuck with Socialized Crucifixion. And, around 87, you do your first metal record, obviously, Agent Steel's Unstoppable Force record that came out in Music for Nations. And you're also a student at that time at the at University of South Florida.
Well, that's correct. Like I said, I went because, Jim and Tom and Rick said I should get, like if I'm serious, I should get a job in electrical, probably be best to get an electrical engineering degree so I could understand more of the electronic side. So I went back to school, USF, where they went, where Jim and Rick went, and Tom. And so, yes, I was doing that. Yep.
Or when do you first meet Dan Johnson? Because I know he's does the Crimson Glory stuff and everything. When is your first introduction to him personally?
Well, that's hard to say exactly. Dan would know better, but sometime around probably, well, Agent Steel for sure. I mean, because the Whiplash, I mean, excuse me, the Sabotage Avatar stuff is done. That was done when I was just still working at the studio and an assistant. So I don't think I really assisted on any of that stuff too much from my recollection, because that's going way further back. Um, and like I said, there was only one assistant, so they only called me in as needed and stuff. But I think that predates me. Um, but I think like by the by the time he's doing Agent Steel, that I'm an assistant there full time at the studio, working all the time. So I would say then.
And on that Agent Steel record, you're taking care of what the mic setups. You're basically doing the running for the bands. And what are your first impressions of Dan Johnson when when you're watching him work?
Oh no, yeah. I mean, I think it's killer, and I don't know. Like you said, is right. I'm just basically setting up for. I think Jim was the engineer, Tom, and Dan, and as somebody once belovedly called me the studio ass. Like everybody, you just set up everything. I mean, and I say that in a funny way, but no, yeah, you just kind of setting everything up, making sure everybody's happy. Because you have to. I will say this to everybody, and especially if you're an aspiring engineer, is you have to remember this. It's a people business and it's artistic. People are trying to create art. You may not think it's art, but it is artistic. It's art that it's audio art, and people want to be comfortable in that environment to make the best creative product or output that they can, piece of art that they can. So, I mean, like I said, is rather it's going them to get them a chicken sandwich or get them a bag of weed or buy a six pack or take them someplace or just make sure that the mic cables are wrapped up the way they want them. Or, I say, hey, how you doing? You need a cup of coffee or just all that stuff. And then, obviously setting up the mics, mic and the drum kit, you know what I mean? Working with the engineer at the time, you know what I mean? He's telling you what to do and stuff like that. The producer, to make sure he's happy because it's his name's on the record, right? He's paying, you know, like the thing with Dan is that he had earned himself such a reputation, that he would the label would come to him and he'd say, "Look, you give me X amount of money and I'll put out this record for you." Well, that's a big responsibility because at the end of the day, he always put out a good record, a great record, and he was responsible. In other words, like let's just use a number. Let's say they said you got $10,000. That means he's got to buy the tape. He's got to make some money. He's gotta make sure, okay, they got 5 grand in hotels. He's gotta make sure the hotel's paid or whatever. He's gotta make sure the band gets to the studio. If they don't show up, who's gonna get them there? There's a lot of responsibility as a producer, especially when you're doing stuff like we did, which was on a smaller scale. If you're fucking Metallica or Megadeth or whatever, they probably got runners to do all that stuff and lots of money. But for us, nickels and dimes matter and stuff like that. So he was very astute at doing that and making sure everything came on in time and on budget and getting great performances from the players. So no, he was great to work with, and people have said, some of the guys in Agent Steel, mainly the singer wasn't the easiest to work with at the time, but like I said, it's a great record. I mean, Juan Garcia, he was a great guitarist, and Bernie, so it was a lot of fun.
During that time period too, what the bassist Mike, he which was on that record, he left also that same time period. So do you remember, was Richard Bateman hanging around the studio at all? Because I know he was involved with Agent Steel at that time also. I mean, because I know he left Purgatory in '86 and then was meddling with those guys. Do you remember him being around the studio at all, Bateman?
I mean, not specifically with Agent Steel, but Richard was always around the studio. Absolutely.
Great bass player. Obviously we lost him, 2018. Um,
Yes.
And you mentioned it with Agent Steel, if I could have this wrong, but so Combat's giving them pressure, and then I guess John Cyrus is, like, doing the vocal change midway through the record, and your job is kind of to keep everything in line with John? Was that kind of one of the things that you were kind of taking care of with that record?
Well, I mean, I think that's overstating but once again, I think it's just a major thing is like sometimes with artists who are, uh, some artists do well in the studio and some artists don't do well in the studio. And sometimes people have things going on in their personal lives and it makes it difficult for them. And, singing in a studio maybe is very different different, alienating than singing live or when you're just playing with your band live in a rehearsal hall. So for whatever the reason is, uh, I think John was having some troubles. Plus, the other thing too was, we didn't do a lot of uh, bands from the West Coast, so and you have to remember there's no cell phones back then. Getting a
Mm.
hold of people is by landlines only. So
Payphones.
it was difficult with the time difference and things like that. So whatever his personal issues were, I think just my job was to make sure that like, hey, he shows up. That I mean, uh, Dan's paid money for this, that he shows up, that he records and all that, because like I said, I'm not saying anything is intentional or whatever to not show up. And I don't mean to say that about him or anybody, but sometimes you just get distracted and say, fuck it, I'm going to go have a beer, I'm going to go hang out, or I don't feel like showing up. And like I said, that's okay if you have a shit ton of money, but if you don't, you have to remember is when people came to the studio, they were probably paying $100 an hour. I mean, think about that back in the day. That was big money.
Yep.
And so, when you don't show up, it's very difficult for you to go to the label, for Dan Johnson to go to the label and say, hey, Combat Music for Nations, I need an extra 10 grand. Well, what the fuck do you mean you need an extra 10 grand? You told me you'd do this record for 10 grand. I mean, you can probably do that once or twice, but then soon everybody's gonna find out, hey, this guy doesn't deliver on time for the money, so they're either not gonna hire you or be cautious. So I think that was the main thing with John was just trying to make sure that we stayed on budget to make sure that he could get a performance for Dan.
And I think a lot of people probably, maybe not realize the budgets, if you're like you said earlier, like if you're Metallica, you have a huge budget, but you're basically dealing with $5,000-6,000 budgets, right, for some of these albums that are coming at that time period. So you know, um, it's way different than when you're a kid and you think these bands have endless amounts of money, but when you get older, you realize it's totally not like that. Um,
No, I mean, think about this, Tony. I mean, you recorded. Each reel of 2-inch tape was 100 and say $150. That's 16 minutes. So you figure is you need 3 of those. So that's $450 just in tape, just to record the 2-inch, right? Just to get the 24 track done. And then if you're paying $100 an hour, you know, so one day you'd lock out the studio, so that's $1,200. Okay. Then let's say you got to buy all new drum heads. So that's probably $250. Let's just say this. Let's say $500 for strings, heads, rentals, and that's cheap, all that stuff. So, I mean, a 5,000, like I remember this when the Cannibal Corpse guys came down to do Eaton. They drove down in Jack's van. They paid their own gas, I believe. They paid their own hotel, and the $5,000 was for the week to record. And I mean, you know, like I said, I took some money. I think I would take like 500, $800, something like that. But there, like you said, there's not that much money when it goes around. I say it all the time, Jim and Tom and Rick, they were cool. We would lock out the studio for 12 hours, but they would let us record. They pretty much didn't care how long I recorded, which in a way was, they could have said, like most studios would just say, hey, fuck you, the engineer, every hour you go past that 12 hours, you're going to pay additional money. So that's how we would try and get extra hours is to work instead of, 12-hour days, maybe say 16-hour days or something, 18-hour days. But like you said, is $5,000, $8,000 doesn't go a long way, especially, when the band travels, because there's other expenses, food, stuff like that. It's a little easier perhaps is if the band is local and they all live there and they're just going back to their house and they're eating out of their own home and stuff like that. But if you're a traveling band like Agent Steel or Corpse or most of the bands that came over, you know what I mean? You have to pay, Whiplash. Like I said, you have to pay for those guys to sit there. You know what I mean? You just can't give them like $3 a day to eat.
Yeah, and you mentioned Whiplash. You worked with them on their record. So you were a fan of the Whiplash guys, right? It was Tony P, Tony B, and Joe C, which Joe was actually it was his first studio album, correct? Because
Absolutely.
Tony S went over to play with Slayer, replaced Lombardo for a small period of time.
Yeah, they were amazing. I mean, rest in peace, Tony Bono. I mean, he was awesome. But no, those guys were killer. Ship has set sail, sea will prevail, swallow the slaughter, drink the salt water, burning of Atlanta. I mean, they were killer, 3-piece. And they were, like I said, I was just really like assistant, I think, or, I think, I mean, but they were awesome. Good band. You know what I mean? Once again, is I think, they were just caught in that, if anything, caught a little bit in that phase of like, from thrash to death metal, whatever. But they were brutal. I mean, they were killer.
Yeah, and Ticket to Mayhem is a great record.
The band.
It's a killer release. In '88, obviously, you did Atheist, aka Ravage, goes into Morrisound to record 5 tracks that would become the band's 1988 Beyond demo. This is the first recording that you're actually in charge of?
Uh, Probably. It's hard to recall, Tony, but yes, I would say that's probably true. You know what I mean? Like I said, I don't know, it's Slowly We Rot. Rick Miller had started that, but then he got into a car accident and he had to take some time off. So I'm not quite sure which, but yep, that sounds reasonable.
And I know, obviously you put out the book, which we'll talk about, but you said they were not the easiest band to track, Atheist, and Kelly had stated the one thing that he really appreciated early on with you was that you were not afraid to challenge the band in the studio.
Well, yeah. No, they weren't the easiest because, like I said, they were all over, not all over the place, but they were super technical. And I mean, everybody's the one the one thing I always say over and over, it's like recording something in a blender, right? You turn on a blender, it's just and I mean, to use Atheist as an example or any of the fast bands is everybody wants to hear their stuff, right? I mean, and everybody's playing 200 beats per minute. It's fast and playing stuff, and it's hard to get clarity out of that. And so, I mean, I think the only thing I think what Kelly's trying to point out is that back in the day, not to get long-winded, but there really wasn't a formula like you said nowadays, you talk about YouTube or everybody sends files to each other is there really wasn't a formula back then for how to record fast music. Everything sounded fine when it was slow, right? It was always the fast bits that fucking ended up sounding like mud and a bunch of shit. And and so trying to say like, "Hey, you know what I mean? You probably can't do this, or it'd be better to do this," and things like that is these things nowadays, I mean, aren't even a thought in someone's all the new bands or newer bands or the current bands, uh, you know, ideas because they you know what I mean? This is so old school to them, the challenges that we had back then, perhaps, like I said, no one was trying to do that and get the clarity. So I think that's probably what he meant is would say stuff like, you can say you think you know, that bass sound or something works, but it's just going to be mud, you know what I mean, to try and get some clarity, or the guitar sound or the drum sound, things like that is, I just mean, you know, it it was more difficult back then, and especially because we live tracked everything, it wasn't like you could sample or gate, even though we sampled and we gated things, it wasn't like today where they gate the shit out of everything and sample things, or everybody just reamps everything, right? And so you can say, "Fuck it, I don't care about the guitar sound right now," I'm just gonna play and then I'll reamp it when I mix it and figure out the guitar sound. I mean, you had to figure out the guitar sound then and you printed it to tape. And I'm not making excuses, but I'm saying is I think that was what was difficult back then, whereas nowadays everybody's, like, I'll always say this, like, it's check tuning, or using new drum heads or using new strings. I mean, back in the day, you didn't really think about that. You just said, "Fuck it, man. I'm gonna play, man. This is killer. I got this killer riff." But you go in there and you say, "Hey, man, after 2 or 3 songs, your strings sound dead." Well, I don't really notice that. Well, they do sound dead. You just haven't, if I A/B it back, oh yeah, now I hear that, right? I hear that when you A/B it back, you know what I mean, that the sound isn't as crisp or whatever, or the drum heads, you can hear, like, you know what I mean, like, you know, the the heads got welts in them, so now they have funny rings, and even tuning them, and you're putting tape on them to deaden it so not to get the rings. No, let's put new heads on instead. So things like that, but like I said, those problems don't exist, I don't think, nowadays.
And that was what, Kelly, Steve, Randy, and Roger. Roger Patterson was obviously amazing, killed in a car accident in 1991. What memories do you have of working with Roger?
He was the best. I mean, he was unique. Um, he didn't play like a standard metal guy would play. I mean, he had more of a slap and attack, and probably because he was a hybrid, punk stuff and all his influences, and probably better to let Kelly or someone talk about that. But I always people joked or perhaps that he's like Flea of metal. I mean, he just had a style that was unique. And and like I said, is he didn't just chug along. There's nothing wrong with that, chugging along, with the guitar riffs and things like that. And he was just a special cat. And, it really was a terrible blow when like I said, when he passed in that car accident, because I think that is beauty of atheist back in the day is that they all were so diverse. Rand played his guitar upside down.
Yeah.
So when he bent his strings, he was bending down instead of bending up. You know, Steve was very much like a, you know, Neil Peart, very busy technical drummer. You know, eh, Kelly wrote great riffs. I mean, and his vocals, he's more in the Miller style, a cat, not a dog, like Chris Barnes or Grinder or whoever, the Deeps. And they just had a really unique sound, and, I think that's what made them special was all these different parts. You know, I mean, once again, it's like with Sabotage, Obituary, you really can't say, "Oh, they sound like someone else." I mean, you
Exactly.
know what I mean? They sounded like them, and I think that's what made them great, so it was a drag. I mean, obviously, when we lose anyone, but, he was a special cat.
Definitely. And I'm gonna play a track from that demo. I'm gonna play, "Choose Your Death" from the Beyond demo from 1988 from Atheist, and we'll be back with Scott Burns after this track. That was Atheist with Choose Your Death off the '88 demo. We mentioned Dan Johnson a few times already. Obviously he finds Avatar, aka Sabotage, licensed Sabotage Sirens album, which originally comes out on Par Records in '83, and again in 1985 on Combat. And that basically starts a relationship because Death releases Scream Bloody Gore in '87 on Combat, and that leads to them winding up at Morrisound with Johnson.
I think so, yeah. Chuck came back he was out there in California, and then he comes back, and, yep, and Dan has a connection, and they come in, you know, Bill and Rick and Terry and, do Leprosy, and, so I was the engineer for it, and Dan was the producer, and it was obviously it was all of Dan's gig, and, yeah, so it's again Dan Johnson.
And you knew Terry and Bill from the Obituary guys, and from Running Sound, but that was the first time you really got to know Chuck. What was your impressions of Chuck, and what do you think, like, a lot of people say obviously we saw the progression of Death change through the years, from Leprosy, Spiritual Healing, Human, going onward. Um, how would you explain Chuck? That you knew him, you got to sit and talk with him. There's actually videos of some of the recording sessions on YouTube, from some of the albums and stuff. What do you think Chuck's vision of death was?
Well, you know, I think he was so early on with it that he was changing before he had changed by the time, all the extreme guys like Cannibal, Atheist, stuff like that. I mean, to make no bones about it is he really didn't like anything you never heard you'll never hear a blast beat on a death record and things like that is. So for him, just obviously this is speculating, but he was changing and he was more, I think, concerned with musicianship. He was probably one of the first ones to say musicianship and stuff like that instead of trying to be extreme. So I don't know but he was a private guy. He was a complex guy. Obviously, he went through a lot of band members. And I think because of that, even though he wrote all the songs, I think perhaps that's why his records sound so different is because of the style of players he had on each record. Because I think if you really listen to it, you know, Chuck wrote most of those songs. I mean, in the beginning, Rick and James wrote some songs and stuff like that for sure. And I'm sure Paul wrote some on Human. Forgive me, but at the same time, I think it was mainly Chuck, and so I think the songs, his structures typically stayed the same, but it was the players. If you go back to Steely Dan, you know what I mean? If you ever watch a video of them when they tried out players is, doing a solo, you'll hear like 52 different solos and you'll say, wow, I mean, you never know. And then they pick one. But I think that's similar with him. But like I said, he was always, I think, trying to stress musicianship and I think he wanted to bring to the forefront death metal, the quality of the music and not just the extremeness of it. I think that was more important to him.
How was during those leprosy sessions? How was the chemistry with Rick and Bill and Chuck?
Oh no, I think it was fine. It was good. I mean, they were buddies. I mean, and obviously, you know, Bill and Terry come back and were spiritual and stuff like that. I think, the tensions probably were outside of my realm purview of the studio. I mean, um, I think those are more personal issues and things like that. And when you go on the road with people, do press, things like that. And I think that's when uh, problems start to arise. But like I said, when they came in for leprosy, it was all good. Yep.
And Leprosy was the last record that you engineered for Dan.
That's correct. If it wasn't for Dan, I probably wouldn't have had the relationship with Chalk because when he decided to retire or step away, he was the one that said, hey, to Chuck, hey, I think you should, consider using Scott for the next one. And so I'm grateful for Dan for that and grateful for Chuck for giving me a chance, and Bill and Terry.
And then in '98, you're working with Whiplash again, The Guff, Coroner, Toxic, Awake, and then Obituary on Slowly We Rot. Um, Again, Slowly We Rot, like you had mentioned earlier, started by Rick Miller, and Donald was only 15 at the time of that record.
I would say yes, Tony, because I mean, I remember John had like a Forerunner or something, Toyota, and he would drive them in because I don't think, I think Don's obviously younger, the younger brother, and I think John just had his license. It's well documented. I've said it before, but they used to take pictures. You brought up old stuff like Olin Mills, where you'd go to the mall to get your picture taken.
Yeah.
You know, they would do band photos when they were like 14, 15 years old. Their parents or mom would take them and stuff like that. And I mean, but I just mean is that that's how long those guys have been working on it and recording. And so definitely, I think, you know, Don wasn't driving when they started.
And you're also credited for, we had Terry Butler on the show, and we talked about this with him. You're credited for convincing Obituary to downtune their guitars from E standard to D on
I
Cause of
don't
Death.
know about that. I don't know about that. I can't say that. I don't have any recollection of that. I'm sorry, but
Yeah,
I
Terry
think
gives you credit for that. We had him he told us, that you were the influence on that on
well, then it must have been another band sounded heavy because, like I said, is that. But I appreciate that, Terry. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, somebody else must have been doing it and it sounded good. So, but that's cool.
we were talking about Tardy's voice earlier, and, so Monty actually got a hold of Ozzy and, let him hear Tardy's voice, and, is that a true story on a cell phone? Or not a probably not a cell phone, it's probably a landline at that time period.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if he talked to them or if Roadrunner UK said, and I mean, not knowing Ozzy, but everyone knowing Ozzy is, I don't know if he liked John's vocals, but he said it was like the craziest thing he'd ever heard. That's absolutely true. I remember that statement. But I mean, like I said, it's kind of hard to take, with Ozzy, you never knew what he really meant on certain things, if he liked it or if he just, was saying, wow, that's crazy. So either way, it's good because John was the craziest thing ever.
Definitely, and, you also worked on the '92 Incomplete record and then World Demise in '94, and then you also got a credit for, Frozen in Time also, which I was talking to you earlier. I think that's the first time I met you was actually at the listening party for that at Morrisound. Um, and again, Obituary, a band, is it true that John actually got you your first PC?
That's true. I don't think he doesn't recall, but he used to work at Underwriter Laboratories, and he would do quality testing on electronics. And yes, he did. It was a 486 DX, and yeah, because PCs back in the day weren't very, you know what I mean? They weren't pretty uncommon. So yeah, that's true.
I'm gonna play, some Slowly We Rot now off the Obituary-Slowly We Rot record from, 1989, and we'll be back with Scott Burns after this track. This is Obituary with Slowly We Rot. and that was Obituary-Slowly We Rot. And June 24th, 1989, Obituary Morbid Angel Nocturnus Ammon at the military airplane hangar in Tampa, $6, which is crazy. Bring your own beer, all ages. And this was a 6-foot stage, correct? And, what memories do you have of that show? Because you were running sound at that show?
That's correct. Oh, it was fucking amazing. I mean, you didn't know what to make of it when you came out there, my recollection, because it was in the middle of somewhere, a field and stuff like that. And it was like I said, it was a hangar, so the stage was elevated. You know, it wasn't like a concert place. So let's just say that. I mean, and so the stage was up off the ground, and you know what I mean? So, I mean, like most stage at a concert place, but, I I just I guess the most vivid recollections were is Amon comes up and don't really know a whole lot about them, and they start hanging these, plastic statues of, figures of the Catholic Church, um, off the stage, so they're above the ground hanging like 5, 6 feet, and, they start to play, and they're back in the day with the motorcycle gear with the studs, the Slayer looking, you know what I mean? All the, uh,
Spikes and
spikes, absolutely. And, then Glenn goes into this rant and starts smashing these statues, and there's blood and guts. They were stuffed with, like, he went to a butcher shop or something and got blood and guts and just parts. And, anyway, so that looks killer, looks evil. And the funny part was, I guess the guy that put on the show, he's got, like, dogs, pit bulls or something, and they're down there looking up the shit. And, but no, it was a good day because, like I said, all those bands were really killer, and it was just, like I said, it was a weird place because it wasn't like, at a standard venue, you know what I mean? It was, you know, not to say out in the woods, but it was more of a rural location or something like that, but it was a great time.
you're doing sound for that one. Is that the show that, this led to you basically working with, Amon, right? Because you worked on the Sacrificial demo. Um, you were doing sound and Glenn was complaining about the sound?
Yeah, he was. It was funny. I mean, he was like, "Hey," you know, I mean, I make the joke is because I guess I had some notoriety or fame at the time, and he's like, "Hey, whoever's doing the sound, I can hear myself. What the fuck?" He's yelling at me, and I just thought it was funny because, like I said, it wasn't like, "Hey, could you turn on my monitors, please?" It was like, "Hey, you fucking asshole, turn up the monitors." But that's just Glenn, and I mean, Glenn's awesome, so it's a good memory.
Yeah, when you're working on that for that demo with them, what's your impression of, like, you got, Eric, Brian, Steve, and Glenn? How was the, obviously we all know the history of the band. We don't, how it worked out at the end of the day, but early on how was the chemistry when they're going into the studio to do that demo? And then even the self-titled record.
Oh, they were killer. I mean, you knew they were killer right off the bat, just like the other bands. There was no doubt they were killer. I mean, yeah, yep. So, I mean, I think I remember talking to Monty or something like that, not that I had any pull or somebody or Borovoy and saying, "You guys really ought to check these guys out. They're fucking badass." And, I mean, Glenn was the shit, still is the shit, but I mean, they wrote good songs, and I mean, I think the thing for me with him was, the mixing of all them styles of the vocals, not just one straight track. I mean, he really added a lot of ear candy and stuff to death metal vocals. And I mean, I don't know if that sounds weird, but a lot of things to, you know, high parts, low parts, you know what I mean? Just different phrasings, voicings. We are, I mean, this is later on, we are one. But he always was trying to come up with different parts and stuff like that. And I have to give him a lot of credit because I think it's brutal and it makes it interesting.
Yeah, with the pitches and stuff like that. I just remember as a kid, it was, it blew you away, especially, that was a new thing back then. It wasn't like there wasn't like 500 bands like this, it was like, again, going back to the At Death's Door, that's the first time I heard them and I was just like, it was a Dead by Dawn on that one. And I was like, what the fuck?
Sure.
Just, and it's funny because you mentioned Monty, Sacrificial demo. I had read Benton said that he had went down there a bit to New York City basically and bought the demo. And, he had said that you had already contacted Monte and had a copy of the demo on his desk, which I thought was really cool to hear because Glenn Benton also says that Benton had said that about your book. Though I don't know if this is a fact or not, but he said the book, a recommendation for the title of the book would have been the Scott Burns Sessions, the guy I would trust. Basically, I trust with my wallet.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I never, I think the reason he said that you know, perhaps Glenn has had a, somewhat contentious, history with record labels and, all bands do that. And I think he just felt like, I never, I gave I took points the one time in the beginning and I gave them back because, like I said, as I saw that they weren't making any money, and I just never felt that was right because, once again, that's the punk rock thing. I just don't think, I think the band should make their own money. But anyway, that's another subject. But, and so I think I just, I think he felt that I never ripped them off and I didn't. I mean, I always tried to do what was in their best interest because it was their music, and the same with all the bands is. But, I think he'd say that about, probably a lot of people, but it is a funny quote.
It won't to wrap up the Deicide part, did you obviously you did Legion 92, upon Once Upon the Cross 95, Serpents of the Light 97. Um, did you see the tension growing in the band? I mean, as the records were going on, are you surprised basically that it's a different lineup now, or is it not really surprising to you?
No, there was always tension between the Hoffmans and Glenn. And I don't know, I mean, Steve's so cool and so mellow, it's hard to tell. I mean, but there was always tension between the Hoffmans and Glenn. And I think, I mean, just once again, this is speculation, but Glenn is a larger than life figure. And then on the other side is if you feel that you write all the riffs that make those songs or write most of the riffs, maybe you feel that like you're being overshadowed and that like, you're not being appreciated as much as him. And so I don't know but no, there was definitely tension, like, Creatures of Habit, I Daydream You Dead. That's written about the Hoffmans straight up. There's just Glenn, so there was always bad, it got worse and worse and stuff like that. So yeah, there's no, it was perhaps it was surprising it lasted as long as it was. And, I think that's probably why their recording style, Eric and Brian, and like I said, I got no beef with them. They were cool. They would just come in and play their tracks and that was it. They're done. It's very much kind of like the Slayer thing. They just play. There's no overdubbing. I mean, they we would overdub for sure. But I'm saying is they really just wanted to come in and play and be done. That was their take and that was it. And maybe that was some of it their style and some of it part of the tension with Glenn. I don't know but no, it's not surprising, and but like I said is he's a bigger than life character.
And you went with them to Milwaukee, right, in '91? 'Cause didn't they take the plane with all their armor on and stuff?
They did. It was hilarious. It was before 9/11. You could wear all that stuff, and it was amazing. Yeah, we did.
And maybe the big I mean, I don't know if you would call it a big not a big break for you, but a big thing was obviously you did Sepultura in 1989, Beneath the Remains. You had flew out to, Rio de Janeiro well, not Rio de Janeiro.
We went to Rio, Tony. Yep, you're
Yeah.
correct.
So you flew out to Rio, and for you were familiar with Sepultura from, what was it, the Obituary guys were playing Schizophrenia around you back with the '87 record and maybe Morbid Visions.
That's correct.
And you arrive at the airport and you bring guitar strings, drum heads, some of the stuff that you would bring, to make sure they have it for their thing. And then basically you have to pay bribes to get it by the customs to get into the country.
Yeah, they had like 100% tariff on, anything for technology, you know what I mean? Because Brazil wasn't quite as technologically advanced, so once they saw that stuff and then plus it was corrupt, a little bit corrupt, so, Max's buddy, he went around just basically to all the guys, and we talked him down to, like, $300 or something. And I mean, the only, Monty, everybody, they were super cool. As soon as, we got in, it basically took up most of our money for food because it was super cheap to eat there. Like $20 a day, we could all eat, the whole band and me, and then, you know, uh, um, a couple guys that work with them. But, uh, but anyway, so we had to call Monty to get more money, and that wasn't a problem at all. But at the time, it kind of freaked us out because, like I said, it was all the money that most of the cash that I had with me. Because once it, once again, I think the thing to remember about with Sepultura is that all the big producers turned them down at the time, like Perry Ellis, Randy Burns, Cunabardi. Um, you know, I wasn't Roadrunner didn't say, "Hey, Sepultura is cool, let's use Scott." And I don't mean this with any disrespect. I was still young into my career, but, um, they approached other bands, producers, and once again, is most of these producers thought Max's vocals, they were too death metal, right? They just didn't like them, you know what I mean? And then, I think that's the important thing back to is that before Beneath the Remains came out, listening to Schizophrenia, um, if you played it for somebody who was a thrash metal producer, it they were still too way outside. And you know what I mean? And don't take this wrong, but if if Sepultura is way outside back then, think about what people are thinking about, like Suffocation
Exactly.
or Cannibal Corpse. That's way, way outside. So, that's the thing is because, like I said, don't get me wrong, Sepultura was brutal, but they were a little catchier than some of the bands and still some of the producers at the time. Plus, once again, in fairness, I suppose if there was money involved, then these guys would have come around to say, "Hey, yeah, I'd be happy to do it." But once again, this wasn't a big budget record at all, right? There wasn't that much money. So I don't think any of these guys were like, "Hey, I don't really dig this stuff. It's too extreme for me." And stuff. So that's how I ended up doing it. And thank God it worked out that way, and Tom put in a good word for me. I think and Dan Johnson, the Whiplash guys, I think, you know, people said, "Hey, I think Scott's okay." So I was lucky. So it was a lot of fun.
You spent 21 days over there during the holidays. And you're right too, because if you think about it, like during that period, Beneath the Remains, Arise, you could see Sepultura maybe on Headbangers Ball, where you wouldn't really see the Deicides on there and stuff like that. They would. So it was definitely a difference. And you got robbed on that trip, also.
Yeah, but it was just I had a boom box and I had some stuff that my wife had given me because over Christmas and small stuff. But you know, basically just somebody, the hotel, they came in, they had a key and they went through and took the stuff. But
Like a maid,
in the
maybe
big
or something.
in the big scheme of things, it wasn't like it was gunpoint or a knife. I just came back, and the funny part was is they were like, "Oh, well, look at you guys, you're a bunch of long-haired guys, the band. It's probably one of your friends." But, it was like, well, how did they get into my room when the door is not broken? But, like I said, that was just kind of, you know, like I said, the funny part was is that people, even on the beach, like, we would go to because we would record all night long, right? We recorded at a famous studio, uh, Nos Nuvens, Gilberto Gil, who's a famous Brazilian guy. He may have passed. But anyway, so we would have to record from like 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And then like we'd go hang out at the beach for an hour or something like that or whatever before. And most of the people didn't think they were Brazilian because there weren't that many long-haired guys, you know what I mean? It wasn't the culture back then. So anyway, but it was it was awesome. I mean, some of the best times ever, and we had a really good time, and so those guys are the best.
And one of my favorite records you were part of, which we were talking about earlier before we recorded tonight, Slaughter in the Vatican from Exorder.
Yeah.
The band was originally signed to Mean Machine Records. They had a small budget, label folded, and then RCA bought out the contract. And we've interviewed Kyle a few times, which I know you've heard one of the episodes, and he says that you saved the record. And that is, he states that, and I've heard him say it before also, because the first time you basically redid an album from top to bottom.
I think, I mean, because it sounded, I mean, if I recall, I guess Monty had it. They had the record, and it sounded pretty bad, and they came down, and we redid it. At least the guitars and bass. I don't think we did anything with the drums, and then we mixed it. I don't recall. I don't know if Kyle I don't know if he sang at the time, but um, then we remixed it with the new guitars and all. And then Monty, I think then they decided that the drums still sounded bad. And that's when I was telling you how Chris Nail, how amazing he is. He's really one of the, he doesn't get a lot of credit. Um, what an incredible drummer is. He came and replayed. We re-recorded. I think Jim and Tom helped me. We locked up 24 tracks and transferred the tracks over and re-recorded all the drums. And he played to those, even though they weren't to a click. That's how good he was. Um, and then maybe that's when we did the vocals or something. But no, I think we did that a couple times because Monty was really into it. There's the old schism back in the day between them and Pantera and stuff on who came first and who was heavier, blah blah blah. But Monty really, Roadrunner really was pushing them at the time. Yes.
Great story he talked about on our show, which is the known story actually, but especially if you're in Tampa, you know these areas. But after leaving a Burger King on Fowler, he stole the street sign for and the Temple Terrace police arrested him, pulled him over in the parking lot of Morrisound, and he said you and Tom actually bailed him out. Do you remember that evening?
Yeah, he did. I think the sign had his name or something. I don't know if it was Thomas, whatever, and he took it. And, I mean, it was fucking harmless. But, the cops, and plus you're out of town, you're a long haired guy, tattoos, blah, blah, blah. So, they got it in for you. But, no, we went and got him out, and it was no big, I mean, knock wood, thank God we got him out, and everything was cool, and they let him out. But, I mean, whatever. I don't know if the sign was on the ground or something, or if he just took it off because it had his name or something like that, sentimental. But yeah, it was like I said, but luckily we got him back and it all worked out. But yeah, it was pretty funny.
That's one of your favorite. If you had one of the favorite albums you worked on, also.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, they, you know, they had a heavy, they weren't really death metal, but I mean, the whole anti-Catholic, anti-God thing, I dig, and they had heavy fucking riffs, and I mean, you know, they just good music, musicality, the drumming to it and stuff like that. I mean, like he really didn't blast, but he would do like little blast bits, but just heavy, heavy stuff. And no, I really liked it, and it had a groove to it and stuff like that. It was good. And I just really liked his lyrics, and they're more, angry and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Obviously he's not gonna compete with pure death metal singers, like John Tardy, but I think Kyle's killer, man. He's a killer musician, killer singer. I mean, and he just comes across emotionally, with a lot of grit and anger, and I think he's killer.
Yeah, and I don't know if you ever saw. Did you ever see the video? There's actually videos of the studio sessions with you and them on YouTube. Believe it or not, there's them recording the Anal Lust and stuff like that. And they were a pretty rowdy band, though.
They were a rowdy band. Anal Lust up the butt. Yeah, that was a
Yeah, yeah. I got the. I remember when I got the lyrics from that. He sent them to me like 20 years ago, and I was like, "Holy shit!" But and yeah, so you did that, and then you did Cancers to Glory End. I think you went to the UK for that record. Were you a fan of traveling to do records, or did you like to stay at home and do them?
Well, it was okay. I mean, yeah, I think like I got to do the Malevolent record down at Criteria, you know, uh, Retribution, and that was killer, and the Cancer. I think the downside, I mean, is you get familiar with, you know, you get familiar with the place, and so it's easier to work at. And sometimes it's a little more difficult. Once again, it's a little more difficult, especially if you don't have any money to get adjusted to a new studio and stuff like that. So traveling was okay sometimes, but I think most of the bands preferred to come to Morrisound to be a part of the Morrisound, the Tampa scene. But it was good. Like I said, going to Criteria, got to see the Heaven and Hell album, the gold record hanging on the wall there, and that
Nice.
was fucking badass. We did Retribution, and but so it was good sometimes. And Psychotic Waltz, I went out there to record them because they all were a Cali band and stuff like that, and Sadist. But it was good to travel and stuff. And I think at the end, switching subjects a little, that was kind of the knock on me with Scott Burns and the Morrisound Sounds, and maybe I should have traveled more, but it is what it is. But I think most of the bands wanted to come and be a part of the scene and hang out.
Yeah, no, definitely, and, there's only a couple more albums I'm gonna mention, but I do wanna Brett Hoffman. I was a big fan of Brett. He passed away in 2018, and, 1990, you did the Malevolent Creation, the demo, and then Ted Commandments in '91, and 92 Retribution, and '97 in Cold Blood. Memories of working with Brett.
He was amazing. I mean, he was a little different, more on the, he was brutal, but maybe a little more thrashy style, or than pure death metal. But he was quite a presence. He was a good guy, and he was a really good, powerful singer. I mean, those Malevolent records are killer. I mean, I think they're excellent. Like I said, is maybe they're, slightly on the some of the earlier stuff on the thrashier side, which is nothing wrong with that. Then like I said, if you're comparing to pure death metal like Corpse or Suffo or something like that. But he was brutal as fuck, and he was tall, imposing, lanky guy, and they were diehard Bills fans, and it was, I know he had bad health issues, so I'm sorry he passed away. So he was a good guy.
Yeah, it's as we get older, as we see a lot of this, especially in the scene, and, yeah, it's definitely it's the non-fun thing about getting old, man, besides some other shit too, but and,
Oh
you
no,
know
we're not getting any younger. I mean, look at Vinny Days from Demolition Hammer. He was good guy, and funny as fucking hell too. And he passed away too young. Tony Bono, and like you said, Roger. I mean, just that's life. I mean, you never look
Right.
at Sean Reinert, Sean Malone. Jesus Christ. I mean, you just never know when your number's up.
No, you're 100% right, man. It's definitely a reality check. Um, 90, you also history with Cannibal Corpse begins, Eaten Back to Life. They're in Buffalo still, like you said, they're paying basically to come down themselves. And Barnes, when you start working with Chris Barnes, you said he had a vision, correct? Like he knew what he wanted, and you became friends with the bands immediately. And you, now I've heard you say that Cannibal Corpse is one of the hardest working bands ever.
I think so. Absolutely. I mean, they always tried to make sure that, you know, talked about just, they didn't want to rest on their laurels. And, because a lot of times some bands, the, the reviews would say, oh, the first album's better than the second album, blah, blah, blah. But they always tried to want to push the needle, make things a little more complex, a little more brutal, less happy riffs or, things like that. So, I think that they always came in, you know, well prepared and trying to say, and I think it's a testament to them now. I mean, I've been trying to go back to listen to some of the bands that I've recorded after they've left, and I know this album goes back a ways, but I'll say this, the album they did with Eric Rutan, Kill, I'll argue it's as good a death metal album ever, in my opinion. It's brutal. It sounds fucking killer. The drums are killer. I mean, I know it's got Grinder, not Chris, but it's just fucking sick. And I mean, they write a lot of sick stuff. And I think, they keep they keep doing it. I mean, they pretty much kept the same lineup, Rob and Alex and Paul. I mean, he's an incredible drummer. I mean, now last, I don't know, 15 years, plays everything to a click track. I mean, those guys, he's bomb blasts all the time, and Grinder, but uh, they're a really good band. And like I said, I think, like all the bands that are still around, they work hard, right? They're not just phoning it in. So, you got to give them a lot of credit. And, Barnes was a big part of that in the very beginning. You know what I mean? It was his idea with the gore and a big part of that and stuff like that. I mean, it's unfortunate that they, decided to go their separate ways.
And
But I
then,
think, with real quick is, sorry, Tony, but,
no, go
but
ahead.
I mean, hey, they got Grinder, and I mean, you couldn't ask for a better singer. I mean, he's fucking killer.
I was going to ask you about that if he was like pretty much the perfect replacement. That Eaten Back to Life record too. There was no clicks on that, right?
No, we never really did. I never really did much with click tracks. I mean, most of the time, most of the bands weren't doing that stuff back then.
I'm going to play a track off that. I'm going to play Born in a Casket from Cannibal Corpse from the Eaten Back to Life record that came out on Metal Blade in 1990. And we'll be back with Scott Burns after this track.
Jumping on her flesh,
And that was Cannibal Corpse with Born in a Casket from the Eaten Back to Life record. And Barnes used the condenser mic on that record.
Did he? Yeah, I mean, maybe on the first one, I don't know, I know that, like him and, Mullins, they were probably the 2 guys that just, like, got a better sound off an SM57, so if I said that or whatever, if the Cannibal guys said that, but I'm pretty sure later on, through most of the records, he just sang, he did that, like him and Frank, that cup sound through an SM57 because that was just part of how they got their sound. And I'm not saying that's cheating or anything, but they felt comfortable with that and it made them sound, even more brutal. So, but listen, Barnes was killer. I mean, he's still killer. I guess he's doing 6 feet under. I don't know too much about, but like I said, they just had a lot of differences at the time, and for a few minutes there, it got ugly, but I think it's worked out for both of them. He's got 6 feet under, and they've kept Cannibal, and they got George, who's incredible, incredible, incredible singer, and so I think it both worked out, but. He really, like I said, they got into that Ace Ventura movie and stuff like that. He was good at marketing and stuff like that. So, uh, he, like I said, he's definitely, you know, a, a force to be reckoned with in death metal, no doubt.
When you guys are doing Eaten Back to Life, right? It's doing they're 14 to 16-hour days, and it was a very small budget, but the band was very prepared.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, because I think I'll say this, my recollection for all the bands is that, once again, they were all like everybody liked to have fun, everybody liked to party. Don't get me wrong, it's rock and roll. But at the same time, everybody was very serious and they realized they had their shot. Metal Blade was a big label. Slagle signed them. Uh, like the bands on Roadrunner or the bands on Earache Digby's record or Century Media, Nuclear Blast. I mean, but whatever label they were on, they all realized that, hey, look, we got signed to a legit label. This is our chance. And, every band wants to go out and play. I mean, you were in a band, right? I mean, you'd rather play in front of a crowd than, play in front of in a practice hall every night, right? You get more satisfaction off that, gratification off fans screaming for you. So they were all well rehearsed, right? I mean, I'm not saying everybody was perfect, everything had it done, because like I said, we all had to work on stuff because we were all finding our own way. I mean, even me, right? I mean, I didn't know. I mean, that stuff was so wild and stuff like that. It was difficult to figure out a way. But I guess I took the attitude of, hey, like, look, let's just try and make it sound as brutal and as best as possible. Not like some old records where when it got fast, everything sounded like shit. But definitely, I mean, they were rehearsed and ready to go because, everybody knew there wasn't a lot of money.
You did 1991's Butchered at Birth, 92's Tomb of the Mutilated, 93's Hammersmith Face GP. You did The Bleeding in 94. And when do you recall the vibe of the band when Bob leaves and then Barrett joins the band?
Well, so Rob was killer, right? Because he was kicking with Malevolent and Monstrosity and Solstice. I mean, Rob's been around. I mean, like he's another guy who's like a figurehead of, you know what I mean? He was with everybody. I mean, he's just a killer guitarist. So, um, when Ruse left, I mean, I think, you know, Bob was great, but I think, like in the studio, guys would say, or I would say, like, "Hey, you're picking this different from Jack," or you know what I mean, or whatever, and like, "Hey, why don't you try picking this different or playing this phrase it the same way and stuff." So, and some people notice that stuff and some people don't, and maybe Bob thought it was okay and the rest of the guys didn't. So when, Rob comes around, I mean, he's just killer. He's right. Pretty sure he's right-handed. He's got the killer right hand, down picks everything, and it's fucking really precise. So, I think it I think once again it was a positive, and that's nothing to say against Bob because of all the work he had done with the band. I mean, nothing happens in a vacuum. But I think once again they're a band that when someone left, the person it's like, sports analogy, next guy up, right?
Yep.
You get somebody that steps up and you say, wow, that guy's doing a fucking killer job. And that's all you can ask. And I think Rob was that guy too.
Wow. Were you surprised when Barnes left? Was it shocking to you or, not really? 'Cause
No,
you're seeing inside the room, like, obviously, I've been in many recording studios, and when you're there, you see personalities. When you spend a lot of time with bands, you see this, and you get the environment. You kinda, you learn, about the people. So it wasn't shocking to you?
no, because I think, you know, the guys wanted to try some different vocal patterns. Like this has been rehashed and I don't really want to, but I think, the guys had wanted to try something different. Chris said he has his own vision and he wanted to stick with his thing. And that was it and they just said, "Hey, look, we're gonna call it a day," and, I mean, and so and Chris said, "I'm gonna call it a day," and that was it, and, so no, it wasn't surprising at all. Like you said, is it was, like maybe back to your side, it was coming to a head where, you saw uh, these things coming and stuff like that. And, it's just two people with conflicting ideas where there's no compromise, right?
Oh.
I guess if it
And
was a divorce, it would be what do you call a divorce? Um,
mut
what's the term the lawyers
mutual,
use? Yeah. uh, irreconcilable differences
differences. Yes, yes,
or
yes.
something like that, I guess. So,
Definitely.
but, and look, and they're just, and look, thank God for Lee Monstrosity, and he was cool, I guess, and, I think Grinder was in Monstrosity, right? Is that
Yep,
correct?
yeah, yeah, yep.
Yep, and, I mean, sorry, yeah,
The
but,
Millennium record, which we'll talk about at the end here, that's one you worked on too.
yeah, so, and Lee was kind enough to let him go, and George, but, and it all worked out, and then once again, I'll say this, like, that opening scream he does on Vile, right?
Yeah.
That right? That's yep, it's an amazing grinder. I mean, you knew right away, "Okay, this guy's okay."
Wow.
That was it. It was like a 10-second you said, "This guy's gonna be okay."
Yeah, no, definitely. It was, it's hard to replace singers, but some bands have been able to do it through history, and they were one of them. Um, and again, to your character, you also did Asheron's The Rites of the Black Mass in '92, just got a repress on Kenyon Records, which is actually Brian Kenyon from Ace Records label. Uh, Crowley and the crew had recorded the demos in Pittsburgh, and Turbo Records wanted to use the drums and the guitars from that demo, but they wanted Vincent to do, record other stuff. And Vincent asked you to slow down the record a bit compared to the demo, which you guys did. But Crowley said that Turbo wasn't paying the bill, and you actually attempted to get them on Roadrunner.
Gosh, I don't really recall. I mean, I'm sure because of my relationship with Monty that I would say, "Hey, if they weren't going to, hey, give these guys a shot." But, that's about my best of my recollection, sure. And I remember slowing the tape down and stuff like that, absolutely.
With Asheron, obviously Deicide, you've dealt with bands with we know the satanic thing, but I don't know, I mean, Right to the Black Mass may have been right up there with the most satanic record that you know, had worked on because you actually had the Black Mass as part of it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, sure, I don't think Glenn wins I mean, there's no, who's the most satanic, right, Tony? But,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
absolutely. Uh, I mean, I think that, and the kids, the fans bear this out for whatever reason, you know what I mean? Uh you know, they became probably one of the biggest satanic of the death metal bands. Deicide did, you know, and that's just the way it rolls. But no, Asheron was a very good band.
Yeah, great songwriting, I thought. It's a great record.
Yeah, Absolutely.
And then you did 91, you did Devastation also, which you actually met those guys. You actually were traveling with, was it you were traveling with Death. Was it New York City you met the Devastation guys? Because you did the
That
91 record for them.
that's correct. No, I met them, yep, Idolatry. I met them with, yep, up in New York at a Death show when they were playing with Death. Yeah, that's correct.
And the Ideology record that you just mentioned too, is that one of those albums I've heard you say that you never understood why it didn't become bigger than it did?
I think, once again I think because they're a little bit more on the thrashier side compared to in death metal was the current wave, you know what I mean? They were brutal and they were killer, right? But, you know, I'm just guessing off the top of my head, I got to see Rodney at a Death Tribute show a year or 2 ago, and that was really nice to say hi to him because I haven't talked to him since, a long time. But, I don't know, it's one of those things that you just don't know how it all works out on why some records, from my perspective, is just as good as any other some of the records that got more popular, but, I guess the only thing I wonder sometimes is, like, you can throw in Demolition Hammer. I think the world of those guys, and they're amazing, but maybe at the time they weren't quite as death metal or whatever as some of the wave of the death metal bands. I don't know, Tony. I mean, I don't know how that all works, but I think the world, all the like I said, to me, Demolition Hammers, Devastation, they were killer. I mean, like you mentioned Overthrow earlier, they were killer. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's like I said, that's not for me to decide. I don't know what happens.
Yeah, and that tour, did you do that whole tour? That was like the 90, that was Spiritual Healing, right? Did you do that whole go on the whole tour with them, or was it just select dates with Death?
No, no, I think I was just up there in the city or something like that or hanging out or whatever for yeah, no, I did not. The only thing tour I did was I went with, Death overseas when it was Cannibal and Carcass, um, over in Europe for like 14 days on the individual tour, I think it was.
I'm talking about you mentioned records that like, I'll say, like, Resurrection, the Embalm Existence record. I thought that was a killer record, and, obviously, John passed away too, and Kevin also, I think the same year, 2021. But another killer record out of Tampa area, and you were not a fan of the narration, right, of that record, that's speaking, in the beginning and stuff, but anything you remember about recording that with them?
Yeah, no, the Astor Brothers and what did,
The
Marquez play
Roadkill stuff
drum?
too, yeah. You did the Roadkill demo, right?
I mean, once again, it's good stuff, but I don't know if it was just later on and, people thought it sounded like other stuff. I don't know why it didn't take off. I mean, you had Alejandro, who's one of the great drummers playing on there, and, and that,
Dave
uh,
Scott, who passed away also, actually,
yeah,
bassist.
yeah, so I don't so I really don't know how it works, and kids determine it, and sometimes, it's strange.
Yeah, no, definitely, and, 2 more records, and we're gonna let you get out of here. Terrorizer, which World Downfall, which I've heard is one of the records you can still listen to, killer record, I mean, in my opinion, like, a groundbreaking record, you know, well, what can you tell us about what do you remember about recording that? Yeah, I mean, what's your thoughts on that record now, looking back since it was, what, '89 it came out?
Yeah. Oh, it's just a I like it a lot because not that I like it any better than anything else because sometimes I think I make, it sounds like whatever, but it is a killer record. But the fun part about it was that, Jesse and Oscar came over, David, Vincent, and Digby set it up. And, and Pete was obviously here with Morbid and just let it fly. And like I said, it was kind of punk rock. I mean, triggered everything live and did it. And, it was done in 2 days, and, that's kind of fun, and to me, sometimes I'll say this with some things, I've said before about it, thing I like about it is that sometimes you get a lot of money and then you just spend time, and it's just like you're spending time because you have the money or whatever. Where in the beginning, even though we, may complain that we didn't have money, that sense of pressure, just going in there and winging it. I don't know. There's something to me that's special about the liveness and just letting it go uh, as it is. So that's what was fun, and they were great songs, and I mean, speaking of people that passed, Jesse, and
Yeah.
so. But anyway, it was a good time. It was a good record. So.
And that was when that came out, '89. That's right before the death metal scene just blows up, right? I mean, that's kinda, I
Yes.
mean, yeah,
Yeah, I
that's right
think
before then.
absolutely, because Digby was doing that in the grind, and I mean, the other thing to do is that was recorded on an 8-track. It was an 8-track recording.
2 days,
So, I mean,
crazy.
it wasn't even we didn't back to the thing with money, I think the budget, we did the whole thing for $1,200. It was
That's
just
awesome, man.
ridiculous. I
Yeah,
don't even know if I
that's
made any
massive.
money on it. I mean, whatever, I think they just came in, but it was fun. But anyway, it was good, and, here's to, Jesse, so.
Yeah, and, I'm gonna play a track from that, and then we're gonna come back, talk about one more album, and say goodbye to Scott. We're gonna play, Terrorizer-After World Obliteration, and, we'll be back with Scott Burns after this on the Tampa Morgue. and that was Terrorizer with Afterworld Obliteration. And Scott, to wrap up, there's a shitload of bands. Obviously, we could definitely not cover them all. So I did want to, pull out some. And I know people are going to be like, oh, how come you didn't talk about this one or not? But I'm going to end it with Monstrosity's Millennium from 1996. This is the last record that Corpse Grinder does with Monstrosity. And this during these sessions, they actually work in Jason Avery, who was with Eulogy at that time, to kind of transition him into the part. Anything you remember about recording that record?
Yeah, no. I mean, listen, Lee Harrison's killer. The new record's amazing. I mean, he's been doing it all these years. It was very good. And like I said, in Grinder, like I said, I think everybody knew George was going to be special. George was always special, but we knew he was going to be special. I mean, he was brutal. And, like I said, Lee had been around and writing great songs. So, you know, it was a good time, and, like I said, is so and, it was nice, like I said, with George and Lee to work it out that he let him go to Cannibal, because I mean, I could see some people probably getting pissed off about it or having bitter, like I said, but, it's a good record, and like I said, I'll say this, I think the new record that he just put out is just as is better is
It's
good, is
killer, isn't
better
it?
than anything he's doing, and that's hard to say nowadays you know what I mean? But I genuinely mean that the new record's killer.
And you met Lee. I know Lee and Barrett were roommates, right? I think Corpse Grinder stayed with them also when Barrett was playing with Malevolent.
That's
Do you remember the
correct.
first time you met Lee?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, was coming in for the demos and stuff like that, and, he was, once again, a fixture of the studio and the scene and stuff like that, so, but no, I think, yes, they all lived together on and off or whatever, I don't remember the exact because 'cause it's been a long time, but that's correct, Tony.
Yeah, and it kind of, in the book, obviously, the Scott Burns sessions, A Life in Death Metal, 87 to 97. Lee talks about in the book, which brings back a lot of memories to when I was a teenager too, is, you guys were doing the sessions and then going out in the parking lot and listening to the tapes and stuff like that, probably smoking joints like we all did back then. You know, uh, you know, that's another lost art, right? You can't wait to get the tape from the guy because back then it was cassettes, eventually became CDs. But, and you would go out and listen to was that a normal process for you? Basically, you guys would record, go outside, check out the stuff on the car stereos and stuff?
Absolutely, I mean, I had a truck with stereo that I thought I thought was alright and stuff, but we would go out there and listen and stuff because, I mean, you know, like I said, you had cassettes. I remember when we first started getting CDs where you could burn a CD, but they were like $15 a pop,
Yeah.
$25 a pop. That was expensive. But no, we would go out there and just chill and listen and try and just see what it would sound like on a regular stereo because, that's the one, you don't know is, in a studio. I mean, you're trying to use something obviously that's sonically good, but then you wanna play it on something just like maybe just an average Joe is going to have, and plus just to clear your head for a few minutes and get outside and stuff, but no, absolutely, we'd go out there and just have a beer, smoke a joint, and listen and stuff like that.
And again, Lee, says that you were a guy that he can trust, and that's one thing that you did hear a lot about people who have worked with you. And I know you hate and this is the reason why I didn't use this word through the interview. I know you hate the word legend and stuff like that, but to the listener and to the kid who was buying the records, you were a legend to us. And again, I know you don't like that term, so I tried to avoid that during this interview, but
Uh,
it's definitely a tag that you wear if whether you want to or not. And again, you put out the book came out, the Scott Burns sessions, A Life in Death Metal from with David. I do know this history, but you and David, how can you just you can wrap it up as fast as you want, but how did you and David get involved and how did this book come into to play?
well, the legendary thing real quick is I think the bands are the real legends. I'm just lucky that I got to record a bunch of legends, um, because like I said, I'm just grateful and lucky. Uh, as far as the book, so David was doing, uh, the obituary book, and so we spoke a lot during that, because of my history with the Obituary guys. And Tim, my buddy, who took a lot of photos back in the day, we were hanging out, having lunch. He was talking about doing a photo book, art book, and stuff like that. And I really liked that idea. And so we were kicking that around and stuff like that. And then I just happened to bring it up to David one time, like, hey, like the original idea was just more purely just photos. But that got sidetracked real quick because the one thing I did want to do is like you mentioned, like the Guff, Awake, um, some of the bands. I did a lot of demos from the Tampa scene, even, Resurrection. I mean, I guess some of the bands that never got fully signed to big labels. But I really didn't want I said, "Hey, I'd really like the book to be about all the bands, because in my view is anybody that came in the studio, if you didn't have money to record, if you weren't on a label and I was available, you could just record a demo with me." And I was, we were all good with that, Tom, Jim, everybody, you could just hire us and do a demo, and that was no problem, no monies. I mean, besides paying the studio bill. So once we did that, David and Albert, who's awesome from Decibel, and can't thank him enough. And but then the book, obviously it wouldn't become like this coffee table photo book because there were so many bands. David found all these bands. I mean, some bands that I'd forgotten about and stuff like that. And so, but I thought it was important to document all of them because to me is the book really isn't about me. It's just about the scene and how many great, like I said, it was a great scene back in the day. So it was just really to document the history of the Tampa Bay metal scene, and that was it. So that's how it came about, and I think it's awesome because Tim's got great photos in it, and David helped keep me straight and look everybody up and jog my memory and stuff like that. So he's amazing. So I hope everybody, I'll say this is I hope everybody enjoys the book if they're a fan of the bands, because really that's what it is to just to take a trip down memory lane and enjoy the music.
It's a great book. And the last record you did was 97, right? The Suffocation Despised the Sun.
Yeah. And that was a good one, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, really good one. I mean, yeah. And no, they're a great band too. And it was a good time, but like you talked earlier, my wife wanted to have kids. I was getting burnt out. I'd worked a whole lot, and so it was just time to call it a day. So I had a lot of fun. Wouldn't change a thing. And like I said, I hope all the fans enjoy the music and hopefully enjoy the recordings, and hopefully I got more of them right than I did wrong. So.
You had a hell of a career, man. 97, you called it a day. You also did some remixes for Psychotic Waltz and KMFDM and Gravity Kills too on your way out. So you kind of started to, dip your hands in some other stuff also.
Yeah, I try. I mean, the thing that was hardest is that, I mean, the only thing I'll say is that, I became known purely for death metal. So trying to do anything outside of death metal became really difficult. And that's okay. It really doesn't bother me because, like I said, is I just really was happy to be a part of that scene and just enjoyed anything extreme music. And, I mean, like I said, it just worked out the way it was. But, uh, you know, metal in general at the time when I was leaving was you know, kinda was in a downward
Weird time period.
weird time period. Yeah, that's a better way to put it. But I think Tony, that's the one thing, I think the nice thing now is that there's no stigma when you say death metal, like, in the early days, it was like, "Oh, it's death metal." And it
Yeah.
was kinda like, "Oh, it's kinda like, whatever, it's not as cool as thrash metal or power metal or whatever, progressive metal." But now, like, you can say death metal, and people just assume it's like metal, right? I mean, like, you see these huge bands. I mean, that are death metal influenced. And so it's great that like
Amazing
I
players
said.
too. You know,
Sorry?
amazing musicians too. I think that was the funny thing back in the day when people like, oh, it's just death metal. Yeah, but these guys played better than most of the bigger bands, in my opinion, at least. You know,
Oh,
talent wise.
yeah. I mean, like I said, look at Cynic, look at
Yes.
Atheist. I mean, the technical stuff. I mean, and there's something for everyone in there. But to think that the vocal style, the deeps, the heavy, the brutal, has really become more popular than the more traditional, should I say, whoa. I
Yeah.
mean, I never, back in the day, that I don't think that thought really existed, that would be it was just a passing phase. And not that there's right or wrong. It's just amazing to think how times have changed and what's happened. And to think that all those bands, it's really their legacy, because it really has nothing. Here's the thing I'll say is, how many records have these bands that I recorded? They've all put out more records without me than with me. So that is the tribute to them. Right?
Yeah, but you're gonna be like it or not, man. You are you are just like the Morrisound is now a historical
Yes,
landmark,
yes.
and so are you.
Yeah.
You know.
No, and that's all fine and good. And, like I said, you can wheel me out and prop me up. But I'm just saying it's the bands that really have stood the test of time. The kids buy the records of the bands and like the music, and they wrote those great songs. So it's a tribute to them.
Yeah, no, man. Hey, Scott, I cannot thank you enough for hanging out with us tonight. I mean, I'm going to ask you, man, how do you, which I'm sure I can kind of tell your answer already, but how do you want to be remembered at the end of the day, man? It's a question that I can't, you probably don't like this question, actually.
Oh, I have no idea. I mean, Glenn said it good. Trust me with your wallet. That's okay.
Hey, I tell you what, everybody who listens to this show, you can trust Scott, because I talked to Scott at the Tampa Bay Metal Museum, and I had said to Ed when we first got there, I said, I have one goal on this trip, man. I got to meet Scott Burns, actually talk to Scott Burns. I had met him, but I kind of stay away when I meet people, so just not to get in their way. And not to sound like a serial killer, Scott, but you were on the list. I want to get him on the show. Talk to Scott. Scott switched numbers, and heard back from Scott, which again, was a amazing thing, man. And I cannot thank you enough personally. And I know that our listeners are going to love this episode, man. Again, Scott, thank you so much, dude.
Well, thanks for having me on the Tampa Morgue, Tony, and we'll have a beer again sometime. And everybody keep supporting live music, support live metal, and support your local bands.
Yes, man. And we'll definitely catch a ball game when I'm back in town. And yeah, dude, again, appreciate you more than you know, Scott. Anything you want to say on the way out of here?
No, have a good night, and thanks so much for having me.
No, we're going to play some Monstrosity on the way out of here. Scott, I'll say goodbye to you in a few minutes. Everybody else, we're going to play some Monstrosity-Devious Instinct from the Millennium record that came out on Conquest Music in 1996. And Scott, appreciate you.
Thank you, Tony.
This is Monstrosity with Devious Instinct. I'll be back on the Tampa Morgue after this. And that was Monstrosity with Devious Instinct. And I want to thank Scott Burns for hanging out tonight, man. And speaking of monstrosity, Mr. Ed Webb, who is not a happy camper right now.
No, I'm not. I completely did not be able to make any of the episode. I am beside myself. I want to, I'm going to go step in front of the bus when it takes off tonight, and hopefully it just runs me over. Of all the ones
well,
to
Ed,
miss,
you got
this
some
was
kind
not the
words.
one.
We were talking before the show tonight even, and he had mad respect for the new Monstrosity record, gave you major thumbs up, man. You'll hear in the interview when you listen, because I just finished up with him a little bit ago, he says, basically the new Monstrosity ranks up there with all the other Monstrosity.
Yeah, that's a pretty high caliber thing to say, because their past albums are definitely, very iconic. So, yeah, I don't regret a lot, but I should have let Sam sing tonight and went ahead and got on the interview. Sorry, Sam. Like, but yeah, he sang in Terrorizer, so he can do it. He can pull it off. But yeah, what's crazy is I guess this will be one interview that I will be listening to that we did, because I didn't get to hear it. So, motherfucker.
Yeah, man.
Well, thank you, Scott,
great,
anyway,
dude.
for coming on, and hopefully at some point I get to talk to him again, man.
No, Scott was great, and much respect, man. I even have more respect talking to him now than I did before he came on the show. And I, it's just a great guy, some great stories. There's so many bands, Ed. One thing I will say that was really hard with Scott for me. There's so much shit you can talk about because he did over 80 albums. But how do you choose? It's hard because you don't, there's the obvious albums, but you also want to dip into some of the lesser known albums too. So, that was the only problem I had with interviewing Scott is you could talk to the guy for hours and hours.
Right. And it's just like, when you're in a band, somebody saying, what's your favorite song you play? That's like asking you to choose which kid you like better. It's not something you can easily do. I mean, you might be able to say you enjoy one, but your favorite would be, I from the songs I ever wrote, I couldn't tell you one I like to play. You know what I mean? it's just one of those things. But yeah, he's definitely a class act, and again, even though I missed it, I appreciate him giving the time and let us go through his history and tell his story.
That was killer, man. I have nothing but respect. And Ed, again, you know, you have a day off tomorrow, and then you're no, the next show again is in Poland the day after that. And before you know it, you'll be home, man. So you know, enjoy the rest of this tour. Then again, you'll be at Maryland Death Fest, the Milwaukee Death Fest. So you got a lot of shit going on, man. But I'm glad you got to at least get on here, Dorian. I'll be honest, when I knew there was the issue going on a little bit, I knew you were, you know, with the internet and stuff. I said, man, I know Ed is going to be fucking pissed, and I was right.
Yeah.
It's, you know, I'm glad you got on here to at least,
It
you know, do some of the show, and then twice this week with internet, like you said, man, you just never know.
Yeah, no, it's been I told you this off the show that when we were talking about do this, I'm like, man, it's gonna be a piece of cake, dude. To just set up but I forget that there's 3 bands sucking off the Wi-Fi because most people don't have uh, cell phone service. Maybe the guys in Europe do, but in America, I'm one of the few who do because my plan allows it. So, but yeah, it sucks, but I guess we'll see what it sounds like. I'll be letting you know how you did.
Thanks, man. You know, I expect nothing but criticism. But Ed, I want you to have a good show tonight, man. And we are going to bail because, like I said, we're just trying to fuck with Ed's internet, and we're kind of victim to that. So we want to make sure that we get to say goodbye to everybody. Ed, where can they find us?
Yeah, you can find us Apple, Spotify. We're on YouTube, anywhere there's actually podcasts. The Tampa Morgue at gmail.com for correspondence. Definitely hit up the Instagram. I'm getting, now that I'm on Tony's time, they're coming in all hours of the day. So, n- not
It's
in the
normal now.
mornings when I was usually getting them. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's it. Hit us up if you got questions.
Yeah, if you want t-shirts, we have them. Ed will be back in the States next week, so he'll be shipping them from the States, and I'll be shipping them in Europe if you need them. $25 a shirt, and plus shipping. All sizes in Europe, limited sizes in Florida, large, extra large, couple bigger sizes. But contact us, we'll let you know what we have. You can always, again, email us at thetampamorgue at gmail.com. And Ed, have a killer show tonight, man.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate it.
Everybody, we appreciate you listening. Peace.
See ya.
This is King Fally from Deceased, and you just listened to another episode of the Tampa Morgue. Tune in next week and stay fucking dead.